a Saturday. They work for the dean. They work for the dean. Well, she thinks it's important, which is very nice. All right, if everybody will please take their seats and continue with your lunch, we will get started with the next session. I apologize for having to do this over lunch, but we want to give people a chance to get done by mid-afternoon, and that means a tight schedule. All right, we welcome Dink NeSmith. Dink is a 1970 graduate of the University of Georgia. He's co-owner and retired president of Athens-based Community Newspapers Incorporated. In 1972, he borrowed $3,000 to invest in his hometown's Wayne County Press in Jessup, Georgia. Since then, he's been involved in the ownership of more than 50 weekly and daily newspapers in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. But now he's doing something I think he never really expected to do. In November, this past president of the Georgia Press formed a nonprofit to keep the Oglethorpe Echo, a 148-year-old weekly in Lexington, Georgia, from closing. Today, it is thriving in a partnership with UGA's Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communications. So we're making a shift here in our session to the university section. Dink's very much a professional, and he's in partnership with the university. Our sessions this afternoon will explore what universities are doing and can do to help rural journalism. So Dink, we welcome you, and please tell us about the Oglethorpe Echo.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you, Al, and I appreciate everyone coming to Kentucky for the weekend to talk about one of my favorite topics, community newspapers. And my dear friends Robert and Cheryl Williams are there, and since I'm not there, Robert, you and Cheryl can have my dessert. How about that? All right. Wish I could be with you, but please accept my presence by Zoom. Are we echoing pretty good, Al?
We reach you 5 by 5.
All right, it just sounds echoey on this side. Well, many of us have been in the business a long time. You remember when we were riding on Tennessee walking horses and making piles of money in the community newspaper business. Well, some things happened with the recession and the internet and all these other Mark Zuckerberg kind of things. But when people start bemoaning the fact of small town newspapers, I say, well, we used to be riding Tennessee walking horses. We might be on Shetland ponies today, but by golly, we still riding. We are not walking yet. So we're very fortunate that our company continues to prosper and do well. And yes, I was supposed to go to the farm and let our sons and the younger guns run the company, but something came up that wasn't on my calendar. I got a call from a longtime friend who told me that he was going to close his family's Oglethorpe Echo that had been in existence for 148 years. And I had known the Maxwells for about 50 years. And when we bought our farm in Oglethorpe County about 10 years ago, I had started writing a column for Ralph just to connect with the community. And that made me sad. And I said, well, I'm sorry, Ralph. That was on a Monday afternoon. And I thought to myself, well, I'll go see Ralph on Friday. But when I woke up the next morning, I said, nope, not waiting till Friday. I'm going to see him right now. So I raced in my pickup truck to 121 East Main Street in Lexington and said, Ralph, we need to talk about this. In fact, he was writing this front page story to say that he was going to be closing the Echo in 2 weeks on October 1st. Well, I played football for a fire-breathing, tobacco-spitting football coach who said, even a dead man's got one more step. Well, indeed, the Echo was almost comatose. Ralph, my dear friend, had had a stroke. He had turned 70. He had diabetic problems. His bookkeeper was in early dementia. His other staff member in the office was begging to retire. She was in her 70s. And his only reporter had accepted a job at the school system. Well, I said, Ralph, you can't do this. He said, what are you going to do? You going to buy my newspaper? I said, Ralph, I don't need another newspaper, but I don't want to live in a town or community that doesn't have a newspaper. Well, what are you going to do? And I thought a minute, and I looked up, and then I said, we're going to form a nonprofit corporation, Ralph. Just that light bulb came on in my head. And I said, Ralph, we're going to form a nonprofit. Would you donate the Oglethorpe Echo to this new nonprofit? And he said, yes, I would. He said, what you going to do then? I said, well, the devil is in the details, Ralph. Just hold on. And we stood up, and this conversation didn't last 15 minutes. Stood up. We vowed that we trusted each other. We shook hands, and he tore up the story that was going on the front page of the Echo. Well, we walked out and we announced to the staff what we were doing, and they agreed to stay on until November 1st for another 6 weeks to give us a chance to put the plan together. When I got in my pickup truck outside, I paused for a moment and then punched the button and asked that Loretta, I call her in the dash of my truck, said, Loretta, call Charles Davis. Charles Davis is the dean of the Henry W. Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communications, my alma mater at the University of Georgia. And I said, Charles, I've got an idea. He said, what is it? He said, well, I've just formed a nonprofit to run the Oglethorpe Echo, which is about 15 miles from his office. I said, Ralph, and Charles, what I want to do is turn the Echo into a learning laboratory for your journalism students, and let's form a partnership. What do you think? He said, I like it. He said, well, what's next? I said, just told Ralph, the devil's in the details. We got to work it out. Well, that's what we did. We had a handshake over the phone, and we went and we began to go to work. The first thing that we did is my farm helper and we pulled a kudzu off the front of the Oglethorpe Echo. It had covered the sign, and you looked like you were going into a vegetation tunnel to get in the newspaper. Then we took the pressure washer, we pressure washed the front. I climbed up and repainted the sign so people would know we're in business. Volunteers mowed the lawn, we planted some flowers, and inside the Echo was about a 3,000 square foot building, but it was all open, and you could see all of the flatbed press, the linotype, and Ralph has a lot of rental houses, so it looked like a Habitat for Humanity warehouse. Well, we talked to Ralph, and we put up a wall and cut us off just less than 1,000 square feet, maybe only 500 feet. We ripped up the carpet that you could plant sweet potatoes in. The walls were a dull brown mobile home paneling. We got volunteers, we painted that, we added new lighting, we put in some different furniture, hung pictures on the wall, and made it an inviting place for people to come in. And still today, 7 months later, people will walk in, look around and say, am I at the right place? Is this the newspaper? Well, we tried to show a sense of pride for the community. Well, I want to walk through some of this. You have a copy of last week's paper, which was a 30-page edition with a graduation section in it. And then you also have a little handbook that we put together. I spared you slides and a PowerPoint. I thought just give you something you could stick in your briefcase and take home. But these are some samples of what we've been doing. I can't take credit for anything except the idea. There's an old African proverb I heard that says, if you want to run fast, run alone. If you want to run far, run together. Well, we have run together and we have created an organization of volunteers and contracted folks to help us do what we can't do. And it is working and doing well. First thing, again, I repeat, we did was to get the staff to commit to not abandon ship yet. Then we formed Friends of the Echo, probably a dozen or more volunteers. Many of them are retired teachers, retired nurses, retired whatevers, and still have time to want to help. And then we put together a diversified board of advisors of 12 community leaders. Then we talked with the high school, and we have a student advisory board, and it's comprised, again, diverse. You'll see it in the booklet of the student council. We decided the student council would be a good thing to do. And then the Grady College assigned 2 professors. One is an overseer, if you will, and then one is a managing editor working part-time to manage the students. And because we were at the end of a semester and we had Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays come up, we decided we would hire 7 interns to get us over into the semester in January. Well, I threw my heart in this and my wallet followed, and I told the dean, well, Dean, I'll cover 5 of these if you'll cover 2. And we hired those 7 interns for $2,000 each, and they started doing the content. If you look on page 3 in that paper that you have before you, you'll see the interns for this time of year. We introduced them with their faces, their names, and their assignments, so the community could get to know who was covering their community. And then the Grady College provided a page designer. We hired a graphic artist, actually out of C&I, contracted to do the ad design. Then I contracted with the press plant to their bookkeeper to keep our books. And our only staff member that is paid is an office manager that just joined us about 2 months ago. She retired at 52 from the University of Georgia and had been an assistant to the dean at the veterinary school and a development officer dealing with alumni and fundraising. And she's perfect. And she said, I got another career in front of me and you're going to have to run me off. Well, we're not running Tanya Eatson off from the Echo because she has really fallen into a great role. And then we pay Tanya. And then we have a retired electrician, a 75-year-old retired electrician who runs our route. It's about 85 miles a week to go around to the stores and the multiple post offices, and everybody else just pitches in. The newspaper, with the help of the Grady folks, we've created a website, we've created Facebook, we've created Twitter, we've created Instagram. We've created newsletters, and one of the most popular things we've done is add e-editions. If you subscribe and give us your email address, then you get an e-edition, and then you get regular updates till the next edition comes out through newsletters and other things. Probably the e-edition has been the most popular thing. There was some reluctance in the beginning, but when people learned wherever they went, their Echo went with them on their iPad or their laptop or their cell phone. Now we've got folks with gray hair like me begging to get signed up so they can get their e-edition. The last time the newspaper's street sale price was raised was 1988. So the paper was still at 50 cents. A month later, we raised it to $1. It is going very well. The circulation is a little bit of an issue. We'll get that straightened out. We've had about a 15% increase in paid subscribers. Our street sales have hurt a little bit at $1. Some people still wonder why we would go up that much, but they haven't apparently bought a Snicker or a Coca-Cola at the convenience store lately. I tell them I don't know what you can get much for $1 in there. Well, one of our interns, who is Kate is a fellow, University of Georgia fellow, which is, if you're a fellow for the University Foundation, that means you're the brightest and the best in the entire university. There's about 12 named each year. Kate spoke to the Journalism Alumni Board a couple of weeks ago, and she stood before them and said, in my whole life, the best learning experience I have ever had has been working with the Oglethorpe Echo. I don't know how you could get a higher recommendation for what we've done. And on the other side, we live on a big farm out in the middle of the county, and my neighbor Clyde is a University of Georgia man, Vietnam vet, my age, a cattle farmer, and he's been reading the Echo for 40 plus years. But he leaned over the fence and said, I really like what y'all doing down there at the Echo. There's actually something to read in that damn paper now. He said, I used to just look at it, but now I have to sit down about 2 nights a week just to read everything in there. Well, I don't know how you could want any better than that. And of course, as I was working with the university and the students, I told them the story of when Deion Sanders was negotiating with Jerry Jones, owner of the Dallas Cowboys. Jerry said, well, Deion, what's it going to be? Is it going to be 7 million or is it going to be 8 million? And he looked him in the eye and he said, well, Mr. Jones, really, I like them both. I'll take them both. And so Jerry Jones paid Deion 15 million. Well, that's the way I am about newspapers. I don't want just distinguished newspaper, and I don't want just a profitable newspaper. I want both. I'm like Deion, we want both. And that's what we've been trying to do at the Oglethorpe Echo. Well, people will ask, and the dean, I met with the dean and the department head the other day, and they were asking, well, how is it doing? I said, well, we couldn't do it without you because teamwork really, really, really works. But revenue is climbing, readership is climbing, but in our second year, we're going to make more emphasis on that. But I said, set a personal goal for the Echo. In its first 12 months of operation, I wanted to set aside from its revenue $100,000 for a rainy day fund with the hopes of eventually building a significant endowment so that this newspaper can go on another 148 years if possible. Well, in the first 7 months, the bookkeeper told me yesterday that we had $67,354.19 in our rainy day fund. So I think in the next 5 months, we can make our goal. But again, I cannot praise the students enough. They have really done a magnificent job, and it's fun watching them scurry around the county. We are a county of 15,000. Lexington, where we're located, has the grand population of 240 people. We have 450 odd square miles in the county, but you know how many traffic lights we got in Oglethorpe County? 1. There's discussion and it's serious debate whether or not we'll put in the second traffic light because everybody likes the thought. We only got 1. Well, the advisory board, the student advisors, the team of Friends of the Echo, volunteers really, really are making this happen in a good way. And we've gotten publicity across the land in various publications about the Echo. And one thing that I've tried to instill in the staff is that we have to be out among the community. And my philosophy for 50 plus years is there's absolutely nothing that will replace the shoe leather of the publisher on the street. You got to be wearing out your shoe leather all around. Robert Williams was a grand one to do this. And I know I am at the folder of the press when the Echo is coming off on Wednesday, and I'm getting the first 50 papers that come off the press. And then on my way back in the 3 miles to the Echo office, I'm stopping at advertisers and I'm giving them a copy. I'm stopping at key leaders in the community to say, I thought you ought to see this. I want you to be among the first to see this. And it really does make a difference. And then I don't have this is a slide, but this is something we started years ago. Our advertisers, we prepare 11 by 17 color posters, and then the afternoon the paper comes out, we put them on the front doors of the business to promote what Ace Hardware or Lexington Auto Parts is advertising. And it says as advertised, but at the bottom, it's got our brand too, the Oglethorpe Echo, serving Oglethorpe County since 1874. We want to help them point of purchase, promote, and we want to brand the Oglethorpe Echo because we aren't dead. We're very much alive. Another thing, and again, maybe I should have done a PowerPoint, but we started a series that runs in every edition, and we're asking readers, residents, why they love Oglethorpe County, and we're asking them for a 100-word essay, and that's been very popular to see folks write in and tell about why they love their community. Another thing that we've done that I'm very proud of is that we've added great diversity in our coverage, and we began to cover the Black community for the first time, many say, and we've had Black entrepreneurs come in to say, we want to advertise in the Echo because you're now covering our community too. That never happened in the past. Well, I don't know about the past, but I know about today, and I know that what we want to do is make this a newspaper for everyone. One of the stories that I remember so well was a gentleman came in to thank us for running his mother's obituary, and we had a nice conversation in the front office, and then he walked out and he said, I'll be right back. And this Black truck driver who had been watching the transition at the Oglethorpe Echo walked back in. He said, I want to be a part of this too. And he gave me a $500 donation to our nonprofit. Well, we have some people that are sending us $100 a month, just like they were paying tithe at the church. So it really does help to be diverse and concerned and cover the entire community. Last week, I met with, as I mentioned, I met with the dean and his department head and the team around the Echo. And I said, this has worked very, very well. And I'm grateful. I can't praise you enough. But we need to be strategizing and thinking about the Echo AD. And he said, well, what's that? I said, that would be the Echo after Dink, because I'll soon be 74 and I'm going to be going as hard as I can for as long as I can. But we're talking about the future. We want a sustainable model, and we're beginning to talk about that. And Charles said, well, what are we going to do? I said, I'm going to tell you just like I told you on the very first conversation. The devil is in the details, and we will find a way. Where there is a will, there will be a way. Well, time is sort of getting short, and you've got another program coming up, but I want to be available to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dink. I think what you've done here is a really inspiring piece of work. I think the question a lot of people have, how easy do you think it would be to replicate it in other places? You know, you have a certain advantage. Grady College is 15 miles away from Lexington. I've had a similar experience with the Midway Messenger, 15 miles away from Lexington, Kentucky. How replicable is this experiment that you're doing?
Well, at first, I thought we would have all these students. We'd have all these students piled into the Echo in that little bitty space. But just as we're doing today, technology allows us to do a lot of remote work. And yes, we have a special situation with our 15 miles. Some people, some of the students are closer to their stories in Oglethorpe County than they are maybe their apartment, wherever they live. This won't work for everybody, but with virtual and Zoom and other things, it's possible it could be further away than 15 miles. This might not can save every dying weekly newspaper in America, but I know one that it saved. So we'll just share our thoughts. We'll counsel with anybody that wants to explore the idea.
There's another aspect to the distance question. In my experience, I found that unless students really spent a good deal of time in the community, they really didn't understand and appreciate the community deeply. And I know you said you've told them to get out in the community. How successful has that been? How engaged have the students really been with the community at large?
They have done that. They have accepted the challenge. Again, the 15 miles is a benefit, but yes, they could cover a county commission by Zoom, but I want them to be sitting on the front row. And if I'm training them, if they vote, if they suggest to go into executive session, I want them to be willing to stand up and say, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, can you please explain? Can you tell me why you're going behind closed doors? So we're trying to train them to have the backbone to ask the hard questions too.
That's great. That's exactly what we need to be doing. Okay, time for questions from the audience. I think Jessica Walsh has a question.
Hi, I'm a journalism professor at the University of Nebraska, and we have a wire service essentially run with student content. And, it's a lot of work and stress really editing those student stories when you know they're going to be published. So I'm curious what the division of labor is like with the newspaper staff and the journalism professor or professors. Who's editing the content? Who's working with students on assignments?
Andy Johnston is a faculty member of Grady College. He's worked for AP. He was a sports editor of the Athens Banner Herald, the daily there. He's worked for the AJC. His wife is also a professor at Grady. He manages and he edits the copy. He reports to Dr. Amanda Bright, who is a seasoned newspaper person who then got her PhD and began to teach. And she is a backup to Andy in the fall, and I guess it's the spring semester they call it. Her capstone class of 20 students become the reporters, and Amanda helps edit that as well. They don't get paid. We give them some mileage, but they get course credits for that. So yes, Andy is the primary point guard in managing them. But because I live in the community, because I pay taxes in the community, because I vote in the community, I'm feeding Andy ideas. And today with iPhones, we're all photographers, and I provide a reasonable number of pictures when I just see stuff, because Robert and Cheryl will tell you, I'm a news hound too, and I see things. What we did agree in the beginning is that I would handle the editorial page. I write a personal column each week, and I write the institutional editorial each week. We haven't decided to turn that loose to the students just yet. And that was the dean's suggestion. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah, you might want to wait for a graduate student on that one.
Well, it would be interesting. We are a very conservative rural community, and I imagine there's some different views from some op-ed pieces that students could write at this point. But they have gotten along great with our officials and the community. I have not had to defend one student yet. I have not had to arbitrate between an unhappy public official or otherwise and our students. They have handled themselves in a beautifully professional way.
Very good. Clay?
Dink, thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm also a professor. There's several college professors in the room, and I know we're all very interested in what you're doing. What advice would you give to somebody who works on the faculty of a journalism school who's interested in trying to do something like what y'all are doing there? Particularly somebody who is thinking about how they would go about trying to set up an arrangement like the one that y'all have.
Right. What I would recommend is you to contact Dr. Amanda Bright or Andy Johnston, who they're the hands-on faculty members. That'd be better than Charles. I mean, Charles is a wonderful friend, but Andy and Amanda handle the students. What I would do, Al, is if any of the participants would like to share their email addresses with you, Al, then you could send me a batch and we'll sign you up at no charge to get an e-edition, and you can study it for it as long as you like, and to see if maybe this shoe fits your town, your college.
Yeah, we'll certainly do that. Be a good idea. I think one aspect of setting up an operation like this is you try to start simple. You know, when I started the Midway Messenger 14 years ago, I just put up a blogger site. And, you know, it looks fairly decent, and it certainly compared very well to the existing website of the local newspaper in the county seat. Midway's a smaller town outside the county. And we gradually added to that, and finally I had a student go do a story about our project. I thought we needed another third-party viewpoint, basically. And she came back with a lot of good information, including the request that we have a print edition. So we found sponsors for the printing, about $400 a pop, once a semester, and it really increased the visibility in the community. You have to start small and then build on your successes, I would think. Other questions? Well, we're about to start running ahead of time.
Well, I learned.
Any final thoughts from you?
Al, I learned in Speech 101 at the University of Georgia 50-something years ago, if you don't have a great topic to talk about and you want the audience to be happy, let them out a little early. Let them out a little early. So that's what we're doing. Because I've heard enough Baptist preachers that I know the 5 B's of a good sermon are be brief, brother, be brief. And so I want to be brief. Thank you very much.
That's true. And but we've also not subjected people to any PowerPoint slides, and we fed them a good box lunch. So
that's
we
right.
have some happy campers in the room. And hopefully in our online audience too. We hope those of you watching online have appreciated this as much as we have here. Let's give Dink NeSmith a big hand. Continuing on our discussion of what universities are doing and could do, we have Teri Finneman, Dr. Teri Finneman of the University of Kansas. She's an associate professor of journalism and publisher of the Eudora Times, another student-oriented or student working publication. Her research focuses on news coverage of first ladies and women politicians and the suffrage movement. She also does research related to media ethics and journalism history. Her oral history work focuses on local and regional journalism history in the heartland. She's executive producer of the Journalism History podcast. Last year, she wrote the top faculty paper in the newspaper and online news division of the Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communication. She has a grant from the Southern Newspaper Publishers Association to study new business models for community newspapers, and she is implementing a model as an experiment with Kansas Publishing Ventures. This is a great case, I think, of the university getting out into the community and having a test bed for a model. So I give you Dr. Teri Finneman. It should, but we'll try it. If the clicker doesn't work, you'll have to, that's a copy of the Midway Messenger, and there's Teri's.
All right, well, I think my talk this afternoon is really going to pull the threads of everything that has been discussed this far into kind of one centralized kind of place. Today I'm talking about my research with Pat Ferrucci and Nick Matthews, and this is live, ongoing research. I was just looking at Facebook and found new things out myself about my own project just a minute ago, and so it's really off to a great start already. So before I talk about we're currently doing a little how I mentioned, I'm a historian actually. I'm on the research faculty at the University of Kansas, and I'm a journalism historian. And I have been doing oral histories for 8 years with journalists in the heartland to capture their history, because too much journalism history focuses on Washington, D.C. and New York, and that is not representative of journalism in this country. So my friend Will Mari had an idea at the very, very beginning of the pandemic. Let's do oral histories with these journalists as they are going through this pandemic and capture this moment in time. So we did oral histories with journalists straight down through flyover country from North Dakota all the way down to Louisiana, straight down the middle of the country, mostly talking with family-owned newspapers, rural areas, black newspapers, native newspapers. And we did this in the summer of 2020, so immediately during the worst of the pandemic, after the shutdowns and the stress that these people were going through. And then we partnered with Poynter, who published our piece, The Essential Workers. And I was talking about this research at a conference of journalism professors, and the more I talked, the more angry I became. Because I realized this is a colossal failure of higher education, the state of the journalism industry today. Where the hell has the ivory tower been the last 20 years? We are the ones who should have been leading the research, working with the industry to avoid this mess that we are in right now as a journalism industry. And I was like, it is time for the ivory tower to step up and support our counterparts in the industry. So that's one reason that I'm here today. Another reason is, as Al mentioned, I am the publisher, editor, and wastebasket dumper of the Eudora Times. So in addition to being a journalism professor, I also started this newspaper 3 years ago in a news desert community. Eudora lost its newspaper during the Great Recession. They were without a newspaper for 10 years. When I moved to Kansas, I always work with clients in all of my classes, so my students do real professional work. And I somehow found out that Eudora, this community of 6,500 people. Now, I'm from Western North Dakota. That's my accent, is North Dakota. And I grew up in a town of 2,500 people. So to me, a town of 6,500 people was a big community. And I couldn't believe that this town didn't have their own newspaper. That was just a crime, I thought. So I went down to City Hall, I talked to the city managers, and I said, what can we do? So over 3 years later, the Eudora Times continues to publish. I run it with students in the journalism department. They're the reporters who work for the paper. We are a 9-month publication, so we're only open during the school year because I'm research faculty and have to do research in the summer. My full-time job I have to do in the summer. And it's really been great. And we have a very different business model, the uniqueness of what we are. So we are actually funded by donations and government support. The government support, of course, being that the university provides newsroom space, my salary as a professor, and KU Endowment has our bank account, essentially. And then we receive donations from community members and journalism alumni. We've raised $30,000 in the last 2 years, and all of that money goes back to my kids. All of it. I don't take any of it. I invested back in them to help pay them for their time. So related to this Eudora Times model, which has gotten a lot of publicity in the last few years, I am also hosting a conference myself in October called News Desert U, with Meg Heckman, Pam Wolk, and then Amanda Bright from Georgia. And the goal of News Desert U, it's October 21st through to the 22nd, is for journalism educators to gather together and see how can we help address this News Desert crisis. It is time for universities to step up, finally, and do something about this. So we're going to talk about funding, how to start one up, how to get deans on board, this whole process at a conference in October. And then finally, I am a journalism historian, as I have said. And when you think about the crisis that the journalism industry is in right now, if you look back at the history of journalism, it's no doubt we have this mess. So the business model that the majority of the journalism industry continues to use today was created in 1833. Like, let that sink in. 1833. It's June. Okay? So in 1833, this man in the bottom corner in this little top hat here, Benjamin Day is his name, invented the penny press model, moving to an advertising-focused model where you have very cheap subscriptions. 1833. Andrew Jackson was president when the journalism industry's business model was created, okay? It is mind-blowing to think about this. It's no wonder this model is no longer working, okay? Put another way, here's my friend Mr. Ed, horses cost more, right, nowadays than they used to, okay? In 200 years, the price of a newspaper, right? Most newspapers, weeklies that you see cost about $1. In 200 years, the price of a newspaper has gone up 99 cents. That's it. You can't even get a bottle of pop for 99 cents nowadays, right? This is not working. This is not working, okay? So, for my research, we are primarily focused on the Great Plains states in the middle of the country. So we've received a significant amount of grant money to help us with this. The Other Newspaper Publishers Association, the State Press Associations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And then I received an innovation grant from a private donor to the KUJ school, which is funding most of this work. So we started off doing publisher surveys. Our intent was for this to be a national survey. Now, I do history work, I don't do survey work. This is why I don't do survey work. Trying to get people to fill out surveys is a nightmare, okay? So we had intended for it to be a national survey, but found that most of the people who responded were from the Great Plains states, so then we centralized around that concept. So we heard from 132 publishers overall. We then hired a professional survey firm, Coda Ventures worked with us to do reader surveys. We then did focus group. We have done early oral histories, and we're experimenting with 2 newspapers. So this is a very, very comprehensive business model analysis that we're doing. So talking first about the publisher survey, we did that in December and January, so very recently. We got a pretty good mix, even split of men and women who filled it out. A lot of the publishers who filled it out are over age 60, with a fair share between 40 and 60. And then most of them, because a lot of them own multiple newspapers, so they checked multiple boxes as far as the size of the towns that they serve. But the bulk of people serve communities of 3,000 or fewer people. So, in this publisher survey, we gave them about 15 options and said, check all the boxes here. What revenue streams are you to? What do you think they checked? They checked the business model that they have done for 200 years. And it wasn't even close. They just simply did not like any of their options, did not even want to consider them. They stuck with what they knew. Okay? Shocked, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right, okay? So, least popular memberships, e-newsletters, donors, and then we all know that the journalism industry in this country hates government support, even though journalists in other countries accept it and without a problem. Now let's talk about the reader surveys. So this was, as I said, a professional survey company that did this. It was census representative with gender, with age. We wanted to make sure it was a representative sample. Trying to get old guys in South Dakota to fill out a survey was a challenge. They don't like to do surveys there, but we finally managed to get that done. And this was all rural areas. We told the company, leave out Fargo, leave out Sioux Falls, leave out Lincoln. We don't want to hear from them. We want to hear from rural readers. And we asked these readers the same options that we asked the publishers, except what would you be willing to financially support? And found the exact opposite, virtually, of what the publishers said. What readers told us, number one, events, which makes a lot of sense. So I'm from a town of 2,500 people, right? Growing up, one of the most common phrases was, there's nothing to do, okay? So in a small community, it's no surprise they would pick events to have something to do. It was very, very promising how many people did pick print subscriptions still. But then the e-newsletters were also very popular, which also makes a lot of sense, right? Because the COVID years had to change weekly rural journalism to no longer just come out on Wednesdays, but to become 24/7 CNN operations when it was critically important to get information out, right? And that is the world that the average reader lives in, right? They're getting news everybody else, you know, constantly, not just once on Wednesdays, right? They got used to that pretty quickly. So it's not surprising that e-newsletters and getting information more quickly was a favored tactic by these readers who filled out the survey. And then memberships, which also kind of makes a lot of sense because, again, readers today aren't living in the 1800s of a business model, right? They're paying for Netflix, they're paying for a gym membership, right? I mean, this is something that they're used to. And when we asked them about memberships in their form, we simply said a perk beyond a subscription. So that was kind of the hint that they had before they checked that box. The least likely to support, now keep in mind, these are general readers, these aren't businesses that are filling this out, so it makes sense that a general reader wouldn't pick, you know, commercial printing like a business would. But I just include this just to show these examples. Other notable trends. 40% of people who filled this out. Now, this data that I'm showing you is across all 4 states: North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. So this is a mix of all 4 states. 40% very likely are likely to donate. That means there's just free money being left on the table right now, okay? So I don't talk to my parents a lot about my work because I don't think they're overly interested. But I was talking with my mom very briefly about this. Now, my mom I consider to very much be an average reader, okay? My mom reads my hometown newspaper and Us Weekly, and that's the extent of the reading that she does, right? She's just not really into it, right? So whenever I want to know how kind of like, you know, an average reader thinks, I talk to my mom about it, and she's just like, I pay $1 for the Hazen Star. That's ridiculous. I would pay more than that. Like, right? So 40 people would willingly give more money, right? That's being out there. But what was also so interesting, and we specifically told them here, you know, whether this be city, county, state, federal taxpayer money, many actually open to now, the U.S. journalism industry to get on board with that anytime soon, but it was so interesting to me how many people picked that box. Other interesting data. I could do data analysis for years, so I just picked some of the basic things from the Excel sheet to highlight today. One thing that was so interesting, your newspapers stay open. Would you be willing to provide more financial support? Very interesting that men were more likely to give support, to say they would give support, than women. Also very, very interesting is looking at the age breakdown. So we asked the same question: if you knew your newspaper was struggling to stay open, would you provide more support? And I broke this down by gender and age. I think most people would assume that the baby boomer demographic, which has more disposable income, would say sure, but they didn't. They were the least likely to check the box and willing to give support. That is a statistic that continues to just blow my mind, okay? Really, it was the younger demographics willing to step up and support. It's a fascinating finding. So, most likely to support. Dads between the ages of 35 were most likely to say that they would step up and help support their local newspaper. Something interesting to think about from a marketing strategy. Worse support from the 55 plus. Why not women? I'm not sure. You know, we didn't ask any qualitative questions about that, but it's interesting that that was a trend. As long as we were doing reader surveys, that easy to do, as I'm sure you, because you can't just talk about without talking about content as well. This has come up, of course, throughout the other sessions. One, obituaries, most prized content among the readers in these rural states that filled this out. And it's something that I started thinking about before then. Kristen Harriet Pointer, you have read, has done some significant work in the last few years with feature obituaries. And it's something that the Eudora Times started experimenting with toward the end of over 30 years. And obituary book comment. So I had one of my kids reach out. Okay, so we are going to make much more a priority at the Eudora Times going forward with doing feature obituaries. Some of you may be familiar with the Columbia Missourian, which has long had a policy that any person who dies is offered, their family's offered a feature obituary. So we're going to focus on that. No surprise to any of you, of course, feature stories rated number 2, things to do number 3. I have to admit, one of the things I look forward to the most in it well read. Very near the bottom. I read that started to get more specific data that I'm going to show you very much what was on the opinion pages and using that against the journalists at that publication, essentially. I think another reason that opinion may have ranked lower is because people are so bombarded by opinion everywhere they turn that they're looking for real content, and that also came up a lot in our qualitative content. We want more news. We want more news in the newspaper was a frequent refrain. No, it was just rural. It was essentially rural residents that the survey company found. And then we also asked them, do you subscribe to your local paper, yes or no? So that was an option as well. Yep. So here are North Dakota specific comments, and the comments varied a little bit by state, but we'll focus on North Dakota first, mostly because the other states haven't received their presentations yet. Kansas and Nebraska are getting theirs this next week. So North Dakota, showing up before the news is old, be more up to date. So that was commentary related again to, I don't want to wait until Wednesday to know what's going on in my community. I want to know sooner than that. These are the, again, opinion-related comments that came up frequently in North Dakota. Be less political, less editor opinion, more conservative editorial staff. So some of these readers were very bothered by the opinion pages. Write articles themselves. This, I think, came up a little earlier as well. Readers are more savvy nowadays. They can tell when you're just filling your newspaper with news releases that came off your email, right? They want more content. This came up over and over again in North Dakota. More local stories, have more to read, do more feature stories, more local reporting, more feature stories. Like the good news is like there's a huge demand for this, right? They want more. They want to see more value in the paper. These are really, really key stats. And this was surprising to me as somebody from North Dakota myself. So the joke is in North Dakota is that when you get on the plane from, say, Minneapolis to Bismarck or Bismarck to Minneapolis, you're sitting next to somebody and you're trying to figure out who you have in common, okay? That's very much a thing that happens frequently, right? So I was absolutely shocked that 63% of people who filled out the survey did not know who their local journalist was. No idea, right? Now, Pew did a study a couple of years ago. 21% of Americans have spoken to a local journalist. So numbers in North Dakota are better than that, but still, 63%, right? And we've heard the numbers throughout this conference about how many fewer journalists there are nowadays, right? So there's less odds of somebody interacting with one, but even in these rural communities, okay? So that's worrisome for a couple of reasons. One, for trust issues, which we know we have a massive trust issue thanks to some propaganda of the last several years. But number two, it also tells me that too many newspapers are beating down the same path of content. They're going to the same easy sources over and over again, rather than reaching out to new people in the community, talking with people they haven't met before to get new voices in the newspaper. So, and these numbers were pretty similar across all 4 states, actually. Rural states, rural communities. People had no idea who their local journalist was. And besides trust in content, this also had financial repercussions, because people across all 4 states were more likely to pay more if they knew a local journalist, which just makes sense, right? Now, when I talk about money being left on the table, we ask them all kinds of different money questions. So 31% would offer financial support beyond a subscription. Now you may think, well, only 31%. Well, that's 31% of people who are willing to give you money that you don't currently have, right? I mean, that's a substantial block of people, really. And another 34% were unsure. So these are people who are on the fence who could be talked into it if you would just let them know, right? That you need help. Journalism matters, okay? Essentially, you're up to almost 2/3 who are willing to give you more money if you would just explain, give them an opportunity, okay? This was pretty solid across all of the states, that there's just flat 25% of people who just are, won't help you, don't care, problematic, right? We already know that. So, but it was really, really promising how many people would step up and support their newspaper if they knew that they needed it. So I talked about the 15 different categories. I broke these down a little bit by each one and included the very likely, somewhat likely, and undecided. Figured undecided people were enough on the fence that they could maybe be talked into it. So again, very, very surprising how much taxpayer support there was. Print subscriptions, still very strong. Digital subscriptions, a little lower after that. Donations, 71% of people in North Dakota, that's a very significant number, were open to the concept of giving donations. Events, again, by far the highest, and then the membership model. So, therefore, my research partners and I decided to think of these as kind of the core areas to focus on: print subscriptions, events, donations, memberships, with e-newsletters right after that. So then we moved on to focus groups. Now that we had done this research, surveys of publishers, surveys of readers, and we decided to gather publishers from each of the 4 states and have them weigh in on what we came up with. And I'm not sure, my research team and I were actually quite taken aback at how much almost venom there was at the concept of donations, of newspaper owners accepting donations. And there were various reasons for that. And it became clear, if you kind of are interested in journalism sociology, how much of their business model was incorporated into their identity as a journalist. And so, or their personal identity. So some of the publishers thought it was a weakness if they were going to ask for donations. Like it was somehow admitting that they had failed, that they weren't good enough, that their business was a failure if they had to ask for help, right? Which I think is very much, I guess, a Midwestern quality, this overall concept that if you have to ask for help, it's a sign of weakness, which is very unhealthy, of course, right? So that came up. Number 2 is a very entrenched idea of what it means to be a business. They very much saw themselves as a business instead of unreplaceable civic community organization that a newspaper is, right? So the hardware store wouldn't accept donations. Why would I do that? I'm a business, okay? And then number 3 that came up, there's too many others in my community asking for donations. There's kids groups, everybody's hitting up businesses all the time for donations. I don't want to do that too, okay? So there was this resistance to donations. And then even after we said, but we have this data that people would donate, it still didn't really change minds here, which was very interesting. As far as the membership model, we saw that there needs to be a lot more education done with weekly newspapers about this concept, because every single focus group we did, when we asked them, what do you think about a membership model, there was silence, and said, well, what is that? So people weren't sure what that even was, right? And, what is it? How would it work? We had some people who think that their current business model works just fine. They are not interested whatsoever in trying anything else. And then overall, there was just very much this underlying fear, this fear of trying something different. And we heard over and over and over again, I don't have time. I don't have time for this. I can't do this. There's no time. I have no resources. So, taking that into account, all of this 4+ months of data collecting that we did, we then partnered with Joey Young and his team with Kansas Publishing Ventures. They are a fairly young group, very progressive group who are not afraid to take chances, to try new things. I didn't realize the grant deadline was coming up, and I called Joey. I said, you literally have 5 minutes to decide if you want, I'm telling you this whole thing, do you want a partner? I have no idea what business model I'm gonna make your newspaper do, and he's like, I'm in. He had no idea what we were gonna have him do, but he said, I'm in. So they have been really, really great to work with. So a little bit about Kansas Publishing. Owns 4 newspapers in south central Kansas. 2 of them have competing newspapers, or at least 2 of them, maybe 3, have competing newspapers in the community, ranging in populations from 7 very, very tiny towns up to 20,000. So right now, we settled on the memberships, e-newsletters, and events business model that Joey and his team since mid-April have been working to incorporate and is actually going to go live 2 weeks from now. I'm going down to Newton, Kansas in 2 weeks for the official launch of their new model. So their membership model is going to be called Press Club. So what they're doing is they are keeping in place the current subscription price. That is tier 1, right? So we did hear from a number of our reader surveys, you know, I'm a senior citizen, I'm on a fixed income, I can't afford to give more, plus things take time. So we want to make sure that subscribers have that same old they're familiar with, that, you know, whatever. But then there's going to be 2 more tiers of Press Club that you can pay more to get into. I believe what Joey is doing is that I think it's maybe $60 a year for subscription. You can pay another $30 to get into Press Club for 1 tier, so essentially doubling how much money that they would bring in. And to get into Press Club, different tiers, he's still working that out. I need to touch base with him on this. But getting an e-newsletter will be part of that. I think they're going to create 2 new e-newsletters. And then they're going to be hosting events. So they're going to be taking on almost kind of a role of a chamber in some ways by offering mixers every month. But Joey's staff itself isn't doing all of that work. What they're doing is they're getting business sponsorships. So I believe that they're going to businesses like the local banks and asking them to pay about $1,000, $1,200 to be a sponsor of Press Club. Then that business will host a mixer one of the months of the year, bringing people into their business, doing the food, all of that, right? They'll get a big ad in the paper saying that they're a sponsor of Press Club, that they're doing this. And so far, it has been really successful because I've talked to Joey from the beginning that we need a constant public relations campaign behind this. So he's written stories. I'm like, you need to write editorials. We need to be explaining to the community what we're doing, why we're doing it. And so far, the community has been really fantastic. Like, I have seen the Facebook comments being left on his and his staff's pages, on the newspaper Facebook page. And people get it, right? And in these rural communities, part of the point of this is it's hard being a young person in a rural community. It's hard to make friends. It's just hard, right? So part of the goal of these social mixers is to create more of a sense of community and bring people together once a month just to have fun, okay? And as far as time, Joey said it really hasn't taken that much time to add this new business model. Him and his staff meet Fridays over lunch. They meet from 12 to 1, have lunch together, and they shoot the breeze and talk this out. And they are keeping like very clear meeting minutes, because I told them this is a historical project, don't throw anything away. And they are taking that very seriously. So they are creating just these extremely detailed business meeting minutes of everything that they discuss, because the ultimate goal when we're done here is to create packets that we can hand out to weekly newspapers across the country of this is the business model that Kansas Publishing Ventures has created. Here is how you can easily incorporate this model into your own newsroom as well. So by getting out ahead of this, talking with key stakeholders in his community, we're behind this, right? We have the support of the University of Kansas. Readers get involved with us, right? We're also going to be doing this project in Hillsborough, a community of about 2,500 people, in addition to doing it in Newton, to do it in 2 different communities to see how this plays out. So we are planning to study this for 1 year. They officially got started around May 1st, so we're going to track them all the way till next May 1st to track how their revenue has changed, how it hasn't changed. Joey will start joining me on speaking circuits to go around so we can answer those very specific questions that weekly publishers would have about what he did. And you know, when I talked to him about it, so we are giving him some funding because the initial thought was, you know, I don't want to cause harm to this business. So I'm like, we're going to give you some funding. So if you lose money, then we've made you whole, right? And he's just like, this isn't going to fail. This isn't going to fail. And he just went into it with that attitude, which has made all the difference. He is 100% committed to making this change, to bringing in more revenue. And then, you know, I've asked him, you know, what are you going to do if you have all this extra revenue? And he's like, I'm going to give my staff more money, right? Because it's very, very difficult to get journalists, right, to rural communities. And that's especially an issue that is going to only get harder with Generation Z, because with how much student debt these kids have coming out of college, making $25,000 a year isn't going to cut it, right? So that is a significant challenge with the future workforce, is the debt that they're coming out with, and the financial needs that they're going to have as well. All right, so that is where we are right now with our research in progress.
Well, thank you very much. Got a lot of I have some questions, but let's see what questions the audience has. I believe we have one from our online audience.
With the research that you did where you found that middle-aged men were the most likely, did you correlate that to earning potential? Because middle-aged men overall are going to earn more than, you know, boomers on a fixed income, and sadly women of all ages.
Yeah.
So was there any correlation between, you know, like how much they earn and how willing they were to say that they would donate?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure because we didn't ask we didn't have a question asking about how much income, because a lot of people aren't comfortable answering those kinds of questions, but it's certainly possible. Certainly possible. Yeah.
Matt Paxton.
I'd be interested in following this. Is this going to be published on a basis? And if so, where can I follow it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've gotten that a few times. So far, we have been so busy hitting the ground running on the practical and working with Joey and getting this started that we haven't written anything down yet. Because we're just too busy trying to get this out and get it to work. But that is, we actually will have a meeting about that in the next 2 weeks. To start writing some of this down. Certainly we hope that Pointer and some of those other organizations will start writing about this. You know, I think we also wanted to wait just a little bit to see how it takes off with Joey's newsroom, because that's the first question people are going to have. So hopefully by early fall we can start having something written up.
Steve Stewart has a question, but first Ryan Craig.
Oh, me first. Okay. I actually follow something very similar. I actually belong to Garden and Gun Club. It's a magazine out of South Carolina, and they have a bourbon place in Kentucky, that's really why I hooked up with it. But that's beside the point. Is this kind of along that model where basically it becomes its own brand at some point?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that what you're kind of looking for?
Absolutely.
How would you go about doing that? I mean, in a smaller community, is it just, you know, the newspapers doing this at this time, or does it become products? Does it become more tied into the actual print product, or are you just open to everything right now?
Yeah, I think we're open to everything right now. I mean, Joey is very much a throw something at the ceiling and see if it sticks kind of guy. They have talked about different things. This is, again, I need to, when I go down there in 2 weeks, I'm doing oral histories with his staff as we go throughout this process to capture how attitudes change and things change over the next year. So I haven't talked to him since the end of April officially. But I know before they'd been discussing like having press club membership cards, press club coffee mugs, press club shirts.
They need the little cards you can put in the hats. I just think that's cool.
Yeah, that would be fun too.
But I was just saying is that, I mean, it does have its own chance to monetize for other things. And if they're a big sponsor of a big event, like you said, I come from a very small place too,
Yes.
in Western Kentucky, which is probably not as flat as yours, but close. But it's, but you know, when you come from a small place, the big events are actually even bigger. And so I guess that's part of it, right?
Yeah, and Joey for the last few years already has been hosting an event. I forget what the name is, but it's something like Blues and Brews. There's beer and there's music. I know that much. And that's gone pretty well for them. Now, in the other community that we're looking to work with, it's a very different personality of that community. And so we've been having he decided to focus on Newton first and get one thing under control before we move to this other community, which has a different personality, a different demographic. But we've talked about things like doing cooking demonstrations, right? For like the ladies in the room, I mean, Taste to Home, when they had, I mean, those places were packed. Those were packed, right? So maybe something like that could work in a community like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Steve Stewart. I'm sorry.
Still not clear
go
on the
ahead.
difference between memberships and digital subscriptions. Is adding like access to the events and
Yes.
top of the digital subscription?
Exactly, yeah. And for Joey's publication, I think it was the print subscription, right? And so one of the things I should mention is that for the business sponsors, in addition to all that, they would get so many print subscriptions that they could give to their employees as well. That was another component of the business sponsorship. But yes, the press club is getting those kind of bonus kinds of access points to events. One thing that we had discussed in our focus groups too is that perhaps if you were on the membership model, you could get like a discount card to local downtown businesses or something like that. So there's like a lot of things that you can think of what could I put in a membership packet that isn't a lot of work for my staff, that doesn't have time, but would be a boost to get more revenue out of your community.
Steve?
I was surprised and a little disappointed to see local government rates so low on the list of topical interests.
Yeah.
Seems to be a pretty fundamental disconnect with the question posed on the screen there. What do you make of that? Did you drill down on that?
Well, I mean, when you think about the local reader, you know, for us as journalists, as our identity, it is very much the watchdog identity, right? That is what we've been trained in our college classroom of what a journalist is, who a journalist should be. One of the things you're seeing a shift to with Generation Z, in not just my own research, but what other people have found, is Generation Z is much more service and solutions focused as opposed to and Jennifer's nodding, much more focused on solutions and service focused than watchdog focus. So it's very interesting to have the two kind of, the service dog and the watchdog kind of, and I found that with my own students, right? And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it maybe, what maybe comes into play there is thinking differently about how we write about local government. So when you think about Generation Z and what they have lived through the last few years, school shootings, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, a pandemic, and losing their youth, okay? Gen Z, as a result, is much more like their baby boomer grandparents, where they are much more advocacy focused. To them, we already know the system is broken. What do we need to invoke? We know it. Nothing works here, right? How do we fix it, right? So they're much more solutions oriented. So that is maybe something to think about with the local government reporting, which I think has also kind of come up today, is rather than writing 35 inches of a play-by-play of what happened at county government, how can we blow that up into, let's pick one issue to go into more depth on and why people should care, rather than just the bickering between the two commissioners who hate each other kind of thing, right? So that might be a way to kind of rethink about government reporting as we go forward, is how to make it a little bit more why should there, just kind of stenography of what happened.
the membership model.
Yeah.
So we've got one of the people on our Dean's Leadership Council has started a new, it was a group of local paper in Northern Kentucky, which is the part that sits right below Cincinnati, came together, and I think it's called LINK, right, Tracy? It's LINK for Northern Kentucky, Life in Northern Kentucky or something. I could see that we're talking about journalism in rural America, but in a community like that, I could see a membership model building community on these suburban parts of Cincinnati, basically, could work really well in a variety of markets. Obviously, your events are going to be more tailored towards who your core audience is. But have you guys thought about that? How it would translate not just to like a weekly or a rural newspaper, but to even a metro?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think I could. You know, and for diverse niche publications and in communities, I think this kind of model is very evergreen that could work anywhere.
Tom Silvestri.
So I'm a little worried about the guy up in the top right corner of Joey's panel screen who was blurry and out of focus. I think he's the mastermind of this whole thing.
Oh, is that Bruce? Who was
I don't know. He's kind of blurry in the corner. I commented on government, Steve's point. I think people are so sick of conflict.
Yeah.
And we're in a race to the bottom on integrity between government and us. And so when we participate in that, they just tune us off. I think as newsrooms has winnowed, particularly metros, it's the one beats that never gets cut, because if it's conflict, it's on page one, and people are just crying out for solutions. And if you're not a leader, so I think that's part of it. I'm curious about the publishers who are still backing the penny model. Were they so successful in the old model, or what are they thinking? If the business is eroding and they're holding on to an old model, I see this a lot with the membership that shows up at the press associations. Some of them are being held back by their members. And so you think the press association should be in a lead position, but they're caught in exactly what you saw. How do they not pay attention to what their members want, but how do they tell them that what their members want, the public doesn't want to buy? And more often, I'm just curious as to what were they thinking. And any program that I see people into super sellers, that's another indication we should have the model conversation. Yeah. Did you pick up on, are they just in denial, or are they shell-shocked and they need therapy? Or are they, well, maybe they, but we've also seen evidence of a lot of people who are still caring about the industry because they know that they don't want to leave it in the shape that it is in. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Sharon Burton had a comment. To give the microphone to Steve at some point so he could talk about sort of point you made about the adaptation to the different models. Sharon?
I just wanted to make a comment to his comments. Then my mind often goes back to my covering agriculture for 30 years because that's where I've learned how to live life. But, you know, we've had so many parts of that industry that have suffered, and everyone kept saying, do this, do that, do that. One of those do that is value added, okay? So the guy milking a cow now has to process milk and have people on his farm and play movies. Well, maybe the guy milking a cow doesn't like to play movies. And to me, that's, you know, if we're going to take these routes, it'll work for some of us. I like, you know, we have our 2000 banquet. I love it. That's fun for me. I see this stuff and I think, ooh, that's fun. But there's a whole lot of folks that just want to be in the newspaper business. And I think that's what it is. It's a choice that you can make, but it may not be everyone's choice. And they just would rather stay with an old model than try something that means they're going to be involved in things they just have no interest in. Does that make sense?
Steve, could you address this perceived reluctance to change among community publishers? I mean, you're part of a group that's got a fairly diverse group of papers, lots of different communities, but they do tend to be small. What is it doing in regard to change in revenue streams and how to get the budget to balance?
Yeah, big question. Adaptation is harder when it's still successful, even though maybe barely, right? So
You have to be forced into
I
it,
think
right?
there are jolts happening. Preprints the last couple of years have been a wake-up call. Just going away, frankly. The big ones are going to be legals, though. When legals go, that will be sort of the final jolt. Now,
You speak as if that's inevitable, though. I don't necessarily think it's inevitable.
Oh, I do.
Depending on your state legislature.
Exactly. It's a state-to-state thing.
I mean, we're talking, this is a summit on rural journalism, and we're talking about red states primarily, right? So I think that's a matter of time. But I think that's the reason that publishers have been slow to adapt is it's still working, it's just not working, like it once did, is my theory on that now. I think we gotta be smarter, and some of us are, working hard to adapt, but that's why I believe we haven't so far.
Does Boone as a company have an attitude towards that, or is it adapting to local situations?
Well, an attitude is we better embrace digital, which we've really been doing, getting more focused on reader revenue as we understand that advertising revenue is shakier than ever, right? So yeah, I think we're making the same pushes for digital subscriptions, for example, as everybody else, tinkering with its membership models, et cetera, yeah. So trying all those things.
Jay Nolan.
The question I have is your digital models up here make me think the same things happening on digital from the newspaper side. We have a disconnect between the direction management and the industry are moving. Oh, we can't afford print anymore, we're moving to digital. And your readers and your subscribers weren't showing digital as a preference. So are we out of touch with our audience, or is our audience telling you what they think you want to hear in your surveys?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it really varies by community. I think it really does. In the heartland states that we focused on, print is because you have to think about broadband issues first, right? In a lot of these communities where print is still very much favored. So all of it really depends on the personality of your community, I think. And if you have an older community or a younger community, a growing community, broadband issues, yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Frank Taylor.
Getting back to the question that came up earlier about what we saw with local government on the survey, I was thinking about that. And we've done some internal surveys, both where I am now and some other publications I've worked for, seeing that same thing. But I see a disconnect between what people tell you they want and what they actually do, especially if you can break down when you're doing, say, your analytics, and say, okay, the routine Gary, but when we did an in-depth story that really got to things, that was one of our best stories in readership. And that's what I would say is, I mean, it sounds like this is all based on just a survey, so there could be a disconnect between reader activity and what they're saying when you ask them in the abstract. It's just an observation there.
Yeah, there could be. And this is why it's really, really important to pay attention to your web analytics. So I almost gave North Dakota a stroke last month because I told them that at the Eudora Times won't write a story if the team loses because nobody reads it. Literally no one. We are an online-only publication, so the data that I see is all of our data, right? If literally 5 people are reading this story when the basketball, why the hell should we waste time doing that? So instead what we do is if the team loses, we put up photos, our best photos from the game, and then the score and a cut line. And then that, therefore, gives my sports writers more time. We just got done in early May doing like 10-part series. This is an anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And so we did a 10-part series about the history of girls' sports in Eudora from 1920s to the present. And that went over big time, way more than a losing sports story. Like, you know, and as I told North Dakota, not once have I had a parent call me and say, why didn't you write about my losing kid? Like, I just haven't, right? So it's also like paying attention to your own community and what their own interests are, right? So my paper is also very different because I specifically have a senior citizen beat, right? Like, I make a 20-year-old run the senior citizen beat because that is my community's personality, and senior citizen reporting is very important to them. So we very much guide our content decisions based on what we know our audience is interested in.
So what about holding that basketball coach accountable for losing, story about a losing game? You know, they're usually some of the highest paid employees of the school district.
Well, this is K-12, not,
okay, all right.
not college.
All right.
I have a question, and it may be very simplistic, but you're in Kansas, University of Kansas, and your kids are covering a community in rural western North Dakota.
No, Kansas.
Oh, it's in Kansas.
It's in Kansas.
Well, then
yes,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm originally from western North Dakota.
I thought that the town was.
Yeah, no.
I was going, boy, that's
yeah,
very interesting long distance relationship.
Sorry, no.
Okay.
Eudora is 15 miles from
Great.
Florence.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks for
minutes
clearing
from
that up for me.
Yeah. But that being said, during the pandemic, during summer 2020, I did have 2 of my Eudora students working for North Dakota from Kansas. They worked for the North Dakota Newspaper Association as their interns for the summer, and from Kansas they did remote reporting that any of the weeklies in the state could pick up. So I actually have done that before too.
Jody?
It's encouraging to see that people would support a local newspaper if a high percentage would support a local newspaper if they knew it was failing. Do you have any suggestions on how to let them know?
Yeah, see that's the thing, right? And that has come up in this session as well. With the public, if they know anything, or actually this is probably as big of an issue with incoming students and parents. Our own industry has said over and over that we're dying, and now that there's an impact for that, right? It is pretty much, I assume it's the same at Kentucky, but I mean 2/3 of our students are strat-comm instead of journalism. You know, I have 4 students in advanced reporting in the spring. 4. Okay? And I'm constantly having publishers send me emails, I need people, I need employees, and I'm like, I don't got anybody. This is a serious issue, right? And I know that we as journalists hate PR. We gotta get over that shit, okay? We gotta get over it. Because not only our own we're dying crap, but the enemy of the people crap. We got a lot of crap to clean up here, right? We either need to hire a firm and have them do it for us, or we need to do it ourselves, instead of just assuming that people know better, okay? Because the comments we got, especially from the Dakotas, show there's a lot of healing that needs to be done, right? Especially with how many people have never interacted with a journalist before. So we need to think about how we use our pages, how we use our interactions, right? I tell my students, when you go out and talk to somebody, they may have never talked to a journalist before. And unfair or not, you are representing the whole industry when you have this interaction. And I need you to think about that, right? And it's something that every journalist should keep in mind, right, when we're having these interactions with people. We also created a handout this semester to give to people who aren't media savvy, explaining to them what the process is. I'm gonna interview you, then I'm gonna interview some other people. I may have to call you back with some questions. Here's the website where you can find the story, right? Things we just take for granted that people know. So this is an idea that I got from the Trusting News project that Joy Mayer does, right? To take this extra time to explain to people the process. Because Eudora didn't have a newspaper for 10 years, and that's pretty clear with some of the news literacy efforts. Using our editorial pages, using this time at events. When I was working at South Dakota State University, we called them, played into the thing. Really great attendance. We had like 50, 70 people come and listen to our panel of journalists and just ask us questions. right? And nobody like threw, maybe now they'd throw tomatoes or something at us, I don't know. But it was just a really great literacy event that really helped.
I think we have a question in the back, or up, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Will. Teri, I'd like to take you back to early comment for observation and then ask you a question. The comment was, where the bleep was the ivory tower?
Yeah.
Okay. So in 1989, I think I might have been the only academic on the Future Newspapers Committee for the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And there was a group of us who were saying, I think this industry's on fire. Okay. And then we know what happened. But I think higher education's financial model is equally in crisis.
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to kind of connect those two thoughts, decline of newspapers, decline of higher education, because there's a disconnect in the value system. Okay, and you're a problem solver, and I admire you. But my question is, on your team, do you have someone focused on the psychology of change? I mean, this is something that, you know, I learned early on in dealing with, let's say, newspaper people or newsrooms and so on, that there's a whole field there, right, of psychology that's at work that I think we have to address.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we don't have a psychology person on our team, but that's specifically why we actually chose Joey as our case study newspaper, because that man is salt of the earth. And no BS. He's a straight talking weekly guy who we essentially see as our interpreter, right? Because even though I run a weekly myself, even though I'm fairly well known in Midwestern journalism circles, I know I still have that ivory tower shine on me as much as I've tried to never have it. So that's why we really want Joey to go with us so people can hear directly from someone like them. So we did have that psychology in mind when we came up with this.
We have an online question.
Oh, no, it's just me. Have you all, you talked about not having...
Hold the mic closer.
Hello? Yep. You all talked about not having enough journalism students and how most of your comm students, you know, just don't go into journalism. Is there any surveying? Have you all talked to journalism students, comm students, completely non-comms students and said, you know, why did you go into journalism? Why didn't you? What would make you consider it? Mm-hmm. Is there research like that?
There very well probably is. I previously worked as the South Dakota High School Press Association Director, is one of my many other jobs I used to have. And certainly a key problem in that is how many high schools don't have journalism programs anymore, right? Because that's how I got into journalism. It was really a twist of fate that my high school hadn't had a newspaper for years, but during my junior and senior year, they brought it back and then they took it away again. So in the 2 years in my life when I was deciding what I wanted to major in, we had a school newspaper, which made the whole difference, right? So if you aren't exposed to this in high school, if you don't know a local journalist, right, that's certainly a big part of the problem. So that's something that I want to focus on more in the next year as well. And, you know, we heard that the great presentation about the certain role more engaged, because they have heard over and over that we're dying. So, right, just like we just heard, right, couldn't get the 2 employees, right? And that needs to change with changing our messaging to youth that this is a very viable career to go into.
And I would agree that you have to go even below high schools. You have to go to middle schools.
Yes.
Find a good middle school student who can cover sports for you. Bring that person up. Mm-hmm. And you know, in small communities, you might even be able to offer the prospect of ownership long term. Mm-hmm. We have to start getting younger people interested younger, and that will not only help newspapers, it'll help journalism programs. Right. Let's give Teri a hand for her work and her presentation. So our next is about what universities ought to be doing to help community journalism. We've had a good example for Carey, but I'm sure there are other possibilities out there. And to discuss this, we have Clay Carey from Samford University and Bill Reeder from Ohio University, and our session is going to be moderated by Dean Jennifer Greer. She's been our dean at the UK College of Communication and Information since 2019. She was associate provost, held other administrative posts, and won teaching awards at the University of Alabama and the University of Nevada. She earned a PhD from the University of Florida, a master's from the University of Kansas, and bachelor's degrees in journalism and political science from the University of Missouri. She was a journalist for the Kansas City Star and the Gainesville Sun, has published journal articles on politics and media and several other topics, and was president of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in 2017 and 18. And I'll let you introduce the panelists whose biographies are here.
Okay, thanks, Al. I was going to say, it's scary how much we think alike, Buck, because I was going to pick up on Teri's observation that basically the ivory tower has failed the industry and has to bear responsibility for where we are today. So much of what we've talked about today in terms of journalism, we could say also about higher education, right? So we are also facing business models that don't work. Even though we don't like to think of ourselves as business, we have to have revenue to continue our mission of educating and serving and researching. And so for the 2021 issue was CI Serves the Community. There is a great 4-page article on the work that Al Cross does. He's actually the lead story in our service package that we've put together. I want to give a shout out to Kentucky Health News, Al. I don't think he has mentioned that, but Kentucky Health News has just done such an incredible job. And it's a model that I think a lot of universities should think of as a service option. We have some funding from the state government. Order, and I'm going to put Carey first, and then we'll hear from Bill Reeder, but I'll go ahead and introduce them. Carey, as you can read in your program, he's an associate professor at Samford University, which, if you do not know, that is in Birmingham, Alabama, right down the road from where I spent 12 years at the University of Alabama. Clay was a journalist in Tennessee for many to the an eye of a which is wonderful. He also wrote the book, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about the work in your book, News Untold, Community Journalism and the Failure to Confront Poverty in Appalachia, and that was published in 2017. So I'm going to turn it over to Clay, and then I'll introduce Bill when we go to him. So
thank you, Jennifer, and Al for
do you want to come up here?
I've already kind of built my net.
Okay,
That's all right.
Great.
Thank y'all for. We want to refocus the camera on it.
Thank y'all for doing this and for the invitation. Thank all of you for coming. You know, one of the challenges of appearing at the end of a program like this is that a whole bunch of really insightful people have already said a whole bunch of really insightful things. Is really new and innovative to offer what we've talked about this couple of days. The goal is to help those of us in the room who do research think about how we can take these ideas and use them to create projects that will be of professional value, social value, and economic value. And I want to start by echoing a point that Robert Williams made yesterday and that Teri Williams also touched on again earlier, which is that we all know that the future of rural news outlets is tied to the future of rural places. And Robert shared some statistics yesterday about the decline in non-metro populations nationwide. I feel like I'm echoing. Am I okay? Yeah, okay.
I think you're adjusting the volume.
Okay. So Robert mentioned this, I'll reiterate it briefly. Between 2010 and 2020, non-metropolitan populations in the United States fell by 0.6%. Over that same time period, U.S. growth, or U.S. population growth overall, was 7.4%. And one of the things that we've touched on over the last couple variation that exists across different communities when it comes to population change, economic change, social change. To give you kind of a perspective on that, there were some states where rural population significantly from 2010 to 2020. In the state of North Dakota, at the same time, over that period, the population in West Virginia, a state where I've spent some time as a researcher, fell by 6%. No state's rural population decreased more than this time period. The second biggest decrease was the state of Illinois, where population fell by 5.8%. So different states, different regions, different communities have experienced these changes different. And it is important for those of us who do research to really think about telling of those specific concepts. And what I mean by that is, I think that stories of successes and failures in specific context, in specific places, in specific moments, do have a great deal of academic, intellectual, and professional. I think case study research value in talking about cases that illustrate experiences in communities from the position trying to be oriented. We build on what we know. We build on the information that's out there that can help people make informed decisions. And I'm going to talk briefly about the news Untold. The subtitle of that book is Community Journey and the Failure to Confront Poverty in Appalachia. So that probably gives you a sense of how I felt about the places that I was writing about. I wrote about 4 different newspapers in 3 different places in the course of that research, which lasted a little over 9 months. And all of these places struggled in their own ways. And they aren't necessarily models to emulate. But knowing about those experiences, knowing about those places, and understanding those situations can help us as professionals grow and develop and not make the same mistakes that other people have made. One of the things that I was least looking forward to after the book came out was hearing from the editors of the newspapers that I wrote about. And because newspaper editors can have thin skin sometimes. If you're hurt by that, it's because you have thin skin. So you have no choice but to feel okay with what I just said. But about a month after it came out, I got an email. I saw who it was from, and I thought, here it comes. And he said, you know, what you said was hard to read, but it was true. And there's value in those types of things being said. And so when we think about case study work, writing about newspapers and organizations that are thriving and successful has a lot of value. I think it's important for us to talk about, in a constructive and solutions-oriented way, about other types of situations as well. And it's important to remember, too, that any organization in a rural place is just one of many institutions that are suffering. Community institution that is struggling. Your local schools may be important community institutions that are struggling. In the state of Alabama, a school closed 2 weeks ago. And it radically has changed. It radically will change that community. Your local chamber of commerce is a community institution that may be struggling. So when we think about how to tell the story of local journalism, and particularly the struggles of local journalism, as researchers, I think it's important for us to think about telling that story in a holistic way, because a local newspaper is just kind of one star in a constellation of the social fabric of your place. And increasingly, we're seeing research that understands the relationship between all these different institutions. So that's one point that I just wanted to make kind of off the bat. I want to come back to the question that we were asked to consider at the beginning of this conference, which is how do rural communities sustain local journalism that supports local democracy? And I'm really interested in as a researcher, I spent a lot of time thinking about the last 3 words of that question, supports local democracy. And so I think we need research that centers the idea of democratic practice. Democracy, by its very nature, requires active participation, right? You can't be an inactive member of a democracy. Democracy doesn't work if nobody participates. So to be an active agent of democracy, I need a couple of things. I need information on which to act, and I need the agency to act. That is, I need to know what I can do with that information, and I need to have an understanding of how I could do that. And I think that historically, local journalism research has told us a lot about the first part of that equation, what information we need, but less about the latter, which is how can we as journalistic bodies help people have the agency to really fully participate in democracy. There are lots of different ways civic engagement can play. A lot of times when we think about this, we automatically think about voting, right? I'm going to print the candidate bios and where they stand on position, and I have told people where they can go vote, and I have both informed and empowered them. And that is one way that people can engage civically. But civic engagement can look a lot of different ways, right? If I move to a new place and I find a church home, I have become civically engaged. If I volunteer at the Humane Society, I have become civically engaged. If I go to a public hearing and express my views, I have become civically engaged. If I write a letter to the editor, I have become civically engaged. There are some people in your communities who have the agency to do those things, and there's some people in your communities who don't. And I'm going to talk a little more about engaging those people who don't in a few minutes. But I think that's really important for us to think about. And there's some really good recent scholarship that has kind of moved the needle on of how we can create journalism that will truly help people in place. I'm thinking specifically about community journalism, which is a great read if you're interested. But we need more of this, especially focused on rural organizations and hyperlocal organizations. And we need research that can help us answer some of these questions. How can journalistic organizations equip people to be civically engaged? How are people motivated to be civically engaged? How can we, through journalism, combat apathy and distrust in our news organizations and distrust in community institutions more broadly? How can we help empower people who might participate in a civic way but don't, because in the past they've been disenfranchised or marginalized in some way? And then I added a question to this a couple hours ago that Jim Ivino said, which was, how can we help people turn engagement into habit? Because I think that, to me, is next level work in the field. And I think those are the types of research questions that those of us who work in this sphere can do that can bear fruit, both for academic discussions of these things, for our discussions with our students, and also within practice. So engagement's a central part of all these questions, right? What are some of the reasons that people live in a place? I'm going to treat this like it's my classroom, and I'll ask you to participate. What are some of the reasons that people live in a place but don't engage with the media in that place? Just yell them out, and I'll repeat them in the microphone. There is nothing. If there's nothing to participate, nothing to engage in, you're kind of out of luck, right? Why else? They're biased. They think the media is biased. Right, there's distrust, right? Distrust and some past grievance, right? Well, and that's a symptom of something else, right? They don't take their work seriously. They can't be trusted to do right by me. What's that? Apathy, right? People just check out, right? Why else? They don't know what they don't know, right? Yeah, we're competing in, it was mentioned earlier, we've got a very small window to compete for people's time, right? These are all important reasons. You know, some people don't participate because cost is a barrier. That does exist. Some people don't participate because, or some people don't engage because their lived experience in that place is not reflected in the product. This is the main thing that I research in rural communities. This is a problem of representation. And working in the news Untold, this was a common refrain. I went out into these communities that were all communities that experienced high level of income insecurity, and I talked to people about why they weren't really interested in engaging with the media as it related to poverty, and people said they don't care. They don't, you know, I never see them talk about my experience in poverty. They always fall back on these same tropes. People are poor because it's their fault. People are poor because they are unmotivated. You know, they don't understand my view and my perspective. And as I've continued to do other types of local media work in Appalachia, it comes up again and again, particularly among groups that are historically underrepresented in media. So research can help us in this vein by recognizing ways to identify audiences that we don't have, and by recognizing ways that we can serve for agents of engagement, both in the content of your newspaper or your journalistic product, and in civic life as well. How can we get those people to cease to become apathetic and start to engage in, yeah, the newspaper, which is important, but also in the life of your community? Sometimes the answer to that is simple and straightforward. Sometimes we just need to get out of our bubble and recognize that there are people out there who aren't represented in the story that we're telling about the daily life in our community. But sometimes finding and reaching the people in your place who don't feel especially connected to the community or to your news organization is more complicated. And when we can do it, you're building your subscriber base, and you're also building your communities, bank of civically engaged people, and you're also building democracy. I'm going to give you an example of a moment when this happened in a community not too far from here that I write about in my book. It's a small town near the Tennessee-Kentucky state line, and it was at the time the county inmate best unemployment for, I believe, 2 straight years. It was a place with significant who rural Appalachia. As to people in the community, where because and she struggled to exist as a part of that community in that space. She lost her son to a car accident while she was there, and his death inspired her to try to do some things to give back to this town. So she opened a small non-profit thrift shop, and she didn't make a ton of money, but she would take donated items and sell them, and she gave the money to a couple of different organizations. And nobody came to the thrift shop, and she just kind of scraped along. And then one day, the newspaper editor came. They did a monthly profile of different businesses. And the newspaper editor came to her thrift shop and did one of these standard stories, and it ran on like page 18 of the newspaper. Fundamentally changed her existence in that community. People saw her as something more than that woman from Philadelphia. They saw her as someone with a local story. And she today is actively engaged and participates in that community in important and valuable ways. One little story can change the tide of a person's life when it comes to whether that person feels connected to a space or not. And when we can do that, when we can empower a person to participate in that way, we have made a significant contribution to an individual and to a community. And so I think it's important to remember that true engagement is participatory. And empowerment is often a product of engagement. And so those are other things that when I think about how people who get paid to write about journalism can help us understand what we're doing better, that's another thing that I think about. How can we create empowerment through inviting people to participate in the process of sharing their story? I'm working on another project right now about Appalachian podcasts. I got tired of writing about newspapers, and so I decided to take a divergence and write about people who do podcasts about Appalachia. Any of you listen to an Appalachian podcast? Yeah, do you enjoy it? There are lots of, I did this and I'm like, maybe there'll be like 6 Appalachian podcasts. If you want an Appalachian podcast, there's one out there for you. And I've been talking for the last few months to people who do Appalachian podcasts about why they got into podcasting. And some of them are journalists and some of them are professors, but they work a variety. There's social service workers, and there's a truck driver in my sample and a mechanic in my sample. And the thing that I hear over and over from these people is when I turn on the microphone and talk about my place and I put it on the internet and I know people are listening, it makes me feel like I'm making a difference in a place. Media have the ability to do that. And so I think, when I think about what the future of rural research can look like, I think there's an important place for us to think about how we can continue to create space for people in these communities who feel like outsiders, who feel alienated, who feel disenfranchised, to tell their story in an impactful way. I want to take a slight detour and talk a little bit about broadband in this space. Because we've talked in different contexts about broadband availability and lack thereof at different points in this session. And that's a serious problem. One thing that researchers really need to do, in my opinion, is to continue to push for more granular data about where broadband is and is not available. If you look at a lot of the maps that exist out there about broadband access, it kind of stops at the county level. Before I came here, I was in Anderson County, Tennessee, where my mother and father-in-law live, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is in Anderson County, and Clinton, Tennessee, which is in Anderson County. Internet is no problem. But drive 5 miles down the road, forget about it. No cell signal, no fiber. And so if we have more granular data about places that aren't served by broadband, then I think that helps people who work in those communities think strategically about what you're going to do on the internet and what you're not going to do on the internet. And that's a space where I think academic lobbying and academic pushing and academic research can really help create something that will be useful for academic people and also for people who are regular practicing journalists. Another thing that we've talked about this week is collaboration. And so a central question is, how can news organizations engage in or facilitate collaboration that elevates voices and generates a sense of community and encourages positive change? We've talked a lot about that. I want to just say briefly that the kind of things that people like Teri are doing are really valuable in this space. But I think we need to, and I think we need to continue to grow those types of projects and encourage those types of projects. I think it's important for universities to think about how they can facilitate collaborations between national organizations and regional organizations and local newspapers. So I'm thinking here about places like ProPublica. Southerly is an organization that does a lot of excellent work, and mainly in Appalachia in the southeastern United States, focused on environmental injustice. Southerly collaborates with smaller organizations like the ones that some of you work at. So universities can think about how we can scale those types of efforts to make them viable for smaller organizations. How can we help rural news organizations collaborate with one another? Work is going on in this vein as well that's been discussed. And how can we help center local voices as part of that collaboration? Maybe this looks like regional or topic-specific podcasts. Maybe you want to reach an immigrant audience in your place, in your community, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to free up the time and the resources to do that. Well, if 5 communities working together can produce a topical podcast that would reach that audience, maybe that's one way. And creating those collaborations can be difficult, and it's a space where universities and organizations like that can step in and assist. And then also it's important to think about collaboration with other civic-minded institutions in your community. Nikki Usher's name came up earlier today. She wrote a really good book called News for the Red, White, and Blue, in which she talked about the ways that collaborating with organizations like libraries can help free up some hours to then be committed to more ambitious journalistic work. But how can we partner with other institutions in our community to effectively foster democracy and also to give us the bandwidth to take on more ambitious stuff because they're handling that thing that takes up a lot of time, but that isn't really that hard to do. Make sense? And again, universities, I think, can be helpful, research can be helpful in that it can start to create frameworks for things like that can work. And it can also help us think about how to reduce risk, which I think is part of what Teri's findings kind of illustrate, is that there's often reversion when it comes to fundamentally changing what we do. And I get it. But when research can provide a roadmap and can provide examples, it can reduce that risk in a way that can help make those types of transitions easier. And the last thing I want to talk about really briefly is trying to create more opportunity to connect research to people who practice journalism in a way that is truly valuable to those people. Question for the journalists in the room. How many of you have ever read an academic study? How many of you read and enjoyed the experience of reading an academic study? I read academic studies for a living. They're nightmares, right? I think it's important that those of us who are passionate about this, especially, continue to make opportunities for research to be accessible and collaborative to people outside the academy. Events like this are one excellent way to do that. Opportunities for researchers to truly collaborate with the people who participate in their research are important. When I was writing the News Untold, I did focus groups in these communities with readers and non-readers about their perceptions of the newspaper. I offered all 4 newspapers the opportunity for me to write up an executive review specific to their newspaper. I asked in return that they give me a small ad and post an announcement about it in their community calendar. Only one of the 4 newspapers took me up on it. So when we're in a community, it's easy for research to become an extractive industry, in the same way that journalism sometimes can become an extractive industry. If I ask for your time to hang out in your newsroom and talk to your reporters, and then you never see the fruits of that, you never get any benefit from that, that's not really fair. And so I think we can instead say, well, I'm going to ask you for some time, and here's something very, very specific to your organization that I'm going to offer you in return. There's value there. The last thing I want to plug is a research effort that I'm involved in called the Conversations in Community Journalism paper call. It's an annual paper competition that is sponsored by the Huck Boyd Center for Community Journalism at Kansas State University and the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors, which is a very active and engaged group of weekly newspaper newspaper editors and publishers all over the world. And we seek out specifically built to help people who work in local news and community journalism be successful as agents of democracy and as commercial or nonprofit entities. If you are interested, shoot me an email, or perhaps Al can connect us. If you are an academic and you're interested in doing this kind of work, we pick one paper every year to be presented at the International Society of Weekly Newspapers Conference, which is going to be here in Kentucky in just a couple of weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah. And I have been to some of those presentations, and they're lively discussions between academics and practitioners. And newspaper people are involved in the process of seeking revisions on those papers and selecting the papers that come. So it's another example of some efforts that are being made to bridge the gap between the kinds of work that researchers do and the possible benefits that a practitioner could reap. We'll stop and over to Bill.
Okay, thanks, Clay. And I want to make sure it's academic been working professor at script Ohio University. Dozens of articles on researchers and voices in academia. He did the have audio. Can you hear us, Bill?
I can now. I apologize to everybody. The connection seems to be really, really bad. So can you all hear me?
Yeah, it's from one log cabin to another is what it looks like here. So, I mean, the fact that we're doing this is pretty darn amazing. So,
Yeah.
okay, Bill, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks, first of all, for accommodating my COVID. Gosh, even with the vaccine, it was pretty rough this week. And I really wish I could be there in person, so that I could say hi to some old friends and make some new ones. It was great listening to Clay, especially. Jim. Hi, Jim. Long time. So, there's been many great ideas and observations here. I've been watching the sessions, many praiseworthy initiatives, all striving to tackle the local news crisis, which is real. I agree with those who say, let's not talk about the death of newspapers, but we can't ignore that this is a trying time for the local news business, especially in rural areas, for all the reasons that have already been talked about. And while there's a lot of new stuff and new ideas coming out, like as Al and others have said since the start, there's a lot of old wisdom and old ideas too, that seem to be either getting new intention or they've been rediscovered, often without attribution. I couldn't help but thinking, though, that the current crisis might have been mitigated, if not avoided entirely, had some of the old wisdom and those old ideas been heeded when they were new, and revisited by those who are trying to deal with the issues of today. So I'm going to talk kind of like the history of community journalism research very quickly, to get to where we are today. So as far as we can tell, the term community journalism was coined in the 1950s by a professor at the University of North Carolina named Ken Byerly. He wrote a book called Community Journalism in 1961. It was basically a how to do it textbook, but it was aimed more at practitioners than at college students. And, I was leafing through it just the other day, and while it is, of course, dated, there's a lot of good stuff in there that's still germane today. I think the main thing was his premise that community journalism benefits and also has some unusual challenges because it has he used. It creates opportunities for connection, but it also does create challenges because, when you have a nearness to people, that can create all kinds of ethical problems and practical problems as well. But Byerly made very little distinction between audiences and readers and businesses, advertisers, and public services, public officials, law enforcement, public education, et cetera, because he viewed them all as people who were members of the community. And so the advertisers were members of the community, the local officials, members of the community, which of course we all know now, but when you read about journalism, it's often read as if advertisers are some different thing, or that local officials are some different thing, rather than all part of the same gumbo that we call a community. He also proposed a bottom-up approach to the news business rather than a top-down approach, which was, let the idiosyncrasies of your community be reflected in the pages of your newspaper, which again, a lot of people over the past few days have been talking about. That's the key to success, is let the community and the nature of the community, the personality of the community drive the news content more than what's coming from on high in terms of the ivory tower, or more importantly, from corporate owners. He also heralded the values of what he didn't call, but we might call contact journalism, where journalists are in contact with the audience, with the community on a regular basis, not just parachuting in when tragedy strikes. Recent Pew Center research has reinforced this, is that, while most people don't trust their local media, those who do, who have strong feelings and strong approval for their local media, have met with a journalist in their community, know that their journalists are connected to the community, know that the journalists have an understanding of the community's history, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the visibility of the journalists in the community and their engagement with the community was a key to success in the early and mid 20th century. Now, in one of Byerly's community journalism classes back in the 60s was Jock Lauderer, who's known to many people in this group. Jock, after graduation, created and ran rural newspapers in Western North Carolina before he became a professor in the 80s. And then when he became a professor, he pushed really strong, especially in the 1990s, to address what Teri rightly pointed out earlier, is that, for the most part, higher education had abandoned community journalism. It was the silly little papers. All he cared about was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, star power, star power, star power, and gave very little attention to the community press. Ironically, at the same time that most of their students were doing, engaged learning by producing community journalism through campus newspapers and magazines, et cetera, et cetera. So Jock faced a lot of pushback, as many of us, the scholars participating in the summit, have received pushback from our more elitist peers who look down their noses at community journalism. I also think it's important to note that in his 1996 book, the first edition of Community Journalism, The Personal Approach, Lauderer was the first to crunch the numbers and to find that community newspapers, most of which were weeklies, dominated the newspaper industry, not just in terms of the total number of newspapers, but also in overall total circulation. Like 2/3 of total circulation in the 1990s was with community newspapers under 25,000 circulation. He also was one of the first to note the decline in the early 2000s as he did updated versions of his book. And I think the important things to remember from Lauderer's works were the two main tenets. One was that community journalism takes the personal approach, again, getting out into the community, making personal relationships with people, making news decisions based on what's in the best interest of the community rather than aspiring to meet the standards from some journalism textbook or from the finger waggers in Washington and New York City. And the other one was to be relentlessly local, not just emphasize local content, but to be relentless in coming up with new and innovative ways to tell local stories. And again, a lot of that has been echoed in the presentations over the past 2 days. Now, both Byerly and Lauderer and also some others who were writing about that time were practitioners. They were community journalists who became professors, but there are many true, pure academics who didn't, excuse me, COVID, who did some pioneering research going back to the mid-20th century. Let's start with Morris Janowitz at the University of Chicago, whose in-depth sociological studies of the neighborhood newspapers in 75 some distinct neighborhoods in Chicago helped us understand that the concept that a newspaper is inextricably interrelated with its community. And that if the community thrives, the newspaper thrives. If the newspaper thrives, the community thrives. The newspaper is a conduit for community culture, not just a way to disseminate news and advertising or to make money for the owners. Back in the 70s, an organization called the American Newspaper Publishers Association, which was one of the founding groups that became the NNA, they had their News Research Center. And there was a lot of great research that came out of it. It was more applied research than theoretical research, but it was still really important stuff. A lot of it did focus on metros, but there were some key studies in there that focused on community newspapers. And we learned, for example, that community engagement and newspaper readership are tied together, that people who are more engaged in their communities, who own homes in the communities, who are volunteer in the community, they're more likely to be the loyal readers of newspapers rather than the occasional readers, et cetera, et cetera. And also looking that audiences had a preference for local content rather than for national content, syndicated content, et cetera, et cetera. In the 60s, and Keith Stam at the University of Washington looked further at the connectivity loop between local newspapers and their communities, identifying that communities are much more dynamic than we think they are. Even a small, close-knit town that we think is fairly homogeneous is going to have a lot of diversity within it in terms of ideology, lived experiences, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. of particular note from that old body of research was the Minnesota team of Phil Tishner, George Donahue, and Clarice Olean. They did 30 years of research into the differences between metro media and community media, and some really groundbreaking findings. They developed such concepts as the knowledge gap hypothesis, which is basically that those who are wealthier or more educated benefit more from media saturation than do people in lower socioeconomic brackets. Which is of particular note now with just the constant barrage of information and misinformation, et cetera, coming at our rural communities. They identified the structural pluralism model, which again identifies that communities are not monoliths, that communities are incredibly diverse, even if they're small and relatively homogeneous in terms of race, that there's a great deal of diversity within them. And again, that pluralism can often be ignored by the mainstream media. And of course, their research into the coverage of conflict in communities came up with the notion that while metro media embraced that watchdog journalism model, investigative journalism, hard hitting, et cetera, that local media tended to be more of a guard dog to maintain community cohesion and community harmony, often by not focusing on important problems in their communities or kind of dismissing them or viewing the metro media as kind of the enemy for what the local media does. Starting in the 1980s, media economist Steve Lacy, Michigan State University, he warned us that news organizations that started cutting costs to maximize profits, not to maintain profitability, but to maximize profits, basically to make ginormous salaries for their executives and huge returns for their stockholders, is that they were hurting themselves. That kind of cost cutting to maximize profits was antithetical to long-term sustainability. And then around the turn of the century, UNC's Phil Meyer wrote The Vanishing Newspaper, which is still a classic. He warned us 20 years ago that, quote, public service and the facilitation of democracy should be the primary goal of news media if the news business wants to survive. So, any research about community journalism that doesn't mention at least some of those works should be viewed with some skepticism, if not negligence, bordering on plagiarism, I would say, because they set the stage for many of the things that we as scholars and successful practitioners take for granted. Like the IRJCI, of which I'm an academic partner and very proud to be so, Al, congratulations to you and to the University of Kentucky for supporting it for so long. There have been some other university-based efforts that have focused on the best practices and most serious threats to community journalism. Clay just mentioned the Huck Boyd Center at Kansas State. It's been chugging along since 1990, including the annual research paper competition with the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Some call it ISWINE, some call it ISWINI. I'm more of an ISWINI guy, but it's a great little organization with a very vibrant membership. And I'm sure there are some ISWINI members in the room there and watching online. Jock, of course, in 2001 started the Carolina Community Media Project, which was a really innovative project with a grant from the North Carolina Press Association, where Jock basically went and visited as many community newspapers as he could throughout the state, doing workshops, free critiques, just rolling up his sleeves and pitching in to help them succeed. It was really an innovative project, and the Texas Center for Community Journalism kind of took that model to Texas, starting at TCU, and now it's at Tarleton State. That started in 2009. And back in 2004, there was a small group of us academics who had a passion for community journalism, who, like Teri, felt that the ivory tower was not doing a service to the bulk of journalism being done, not just in America, but in the world. So we pulled together the Community Journalism Interest Group, which is still going strong. It's small but mighty, as it always has been. And many of them have walked the walk. They worked in community journalism, like I worked in community journalism before entering academe. And many of them and us lead community journalism classes, community journalism projects where we get students out doing the work, and of course, scholarly research. I feel a little proud right now that it's like 3 of the ComJig officers are Ohio U grads, as is Clay. as is Pam Walk, who Teri mentioned earlier. So, you know, we have a few scholars at Ohio U who are very interested in this issue. And of course, you know, these efforts at the academic level, in partnership with many of the nonprofit organizations that are doing a lot of this work as well, has inspired and helped graduate students and early career scholars to make community journalism central to their research agendas. And there's a lot of great theory-based, peer-reviewed research that's building on those strong foundations. We heard from them here, Teri's research at Kansas, Jim's work at WVU, of course, Clay's work. Some other research I would recommend that practitioners and other scholars pay attention to is the work on the concept of reciprocal journalism being developed, well, it is developed, but it's being pursued by Seth Lewis, Avery Holton, and Mike Coddington. We have colleagues in Australia, especially Christy Hess and Lisa Waller, who are looking at the role of local journalism in the digital world. Marcus Funk at Sam Houston State, who's doing some fairly advanced content analysis to help identify shortcomings in the digital offerings of community newspapers, basically just focusing a lot on deviant behavior reporting rather than using the digital platforms for more service journalism, solution-based journalism, et cetera, et cetera. We also all owe a great thanks to Priyanya Bengani at Columbia University for keeping close tabs on the pink slime news sites. They're not really misinformation sites entirely. They do a lot of scraping of public records that are online, and they have offshore content farms that are creating things that look like they were locally reported, but they're being written by, you know, some underpaid freelancer in the Philippines. Automation and stuff like that. So these are websites that are popping up, especially in news deserts. They look like news. They have the local news appearances and headlines and things like that. But of course, many of them are being bankrolled by shadow organizations with overtly partisan agendas, et cetera, et cetera. Not really quality local news to say anything, and really dangerous to our democracy by pushing a lot of misinformation and propaganda. Now, my point here is not to be nostalgic for the old days, although I think, you know, there is a degree to which we need to think about these old wisdoms that are especially prescient today. And I think it's important for all of us who work in community journalism, whether we're practitioners or scholars, whether we've been in this business forever, newbies, to heed the wisdom of those elders when tackling new problems. We have this foundation of research that helps us understand what works in community journalism and what doesn't really lead to sustainability. And really, that's the problem that we're facing with the local news processes. There's lots of local news out there, but is the business model sustainable? Is the news of a certain quality that it's going to connect with our audiences and that it's going to hold our communities together? So, you know, for 70 years now, we've known that sustainable community journalism cannot just be a scaled down version of what the big league journalists are doing. And, you know, those who work in developing nations know the term the white savior, that, you know, somebody from some privileged Western country is going to sweep into this developing nation and try to fix their problems, saying, why don't you just be more like us? Well, that doesn't work. In those communities, it has to start with, what do you need? What can we do to help you on your terms? That's the role that community journalism can play in their communities as well. We've known for 60 years that there's a reflexive relationship between news media and their communities, that when a local newspaper dies, it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine, meaning that the community is probably dying too. And we know that the devotion to that connection is the key to success, that a news organization that's devoted to keeping its community connected is likely to succeed. We've known for 50 years that local news media that focus on local issues and local content can combat the knowledge gap between the haves and the have-nots in their communities. And by doing so, they can build resiliency and community cohesion that's truly community-wide, rather than just satisfying those with disposable incomes that advertisers want to reach. We've known for 40 years that quality local news, which includes micro news, which very few journalism students really want to think about, hatches, matches, dispatches, calendars of events, those types of things. Those are the key to sustainable business models. That's information that people want. And Teri's research has shown that that's still the case. And that when you cut quality, when you make cuts in newsrooms just to boost short-term profits, that's penny wise, but pound foolish. We've known for 30 years that media consolidation often impedes local media from maintaining their community connections. We've known for 2 decades now that, as Phil Meyer wrote, news media that continue to slash and burn their existing businesses will end up with slashed, burned, obsolete businesses. So we've heard lots of success stories over the past few days, which is great. And they all reinforce the value of that old wisdom with taking into consideration all of the new variables that were not even on the imaginable. I mean, who would have imagined social media in the 1950s? Who would have imagined cell phones replacing newspapers? But yet the content that people want and the connection that they want with their community remains pretty much the same. And so, the idea that community media should be engaged with the community, consistent theme for decades, consistent theme in this summit. That news organizations should facilitate community discourse. Another common theme here, another old, tried and true kernel of wisdom. That news media should diversify and innovate their products and services is another theme of the summit and another theme of old research. And it echoes the key to success for independent family farms and rural small businesses and rural nonprofits, et cetera, is that, they can't just do one thing at a large scale. They got to do a lot of little things. They got to try some new things. And just as every farmer knows, some years will be good for one crop and bad for another. And you just got to factor that into, that's the thing. It's a way of life. It's not a way to make money very quickly if you want to do it right. The importance to focus on micronews. Micronews is very important to people. They want to know what the weather is. They want to know what the cops and courts. They want to know about the hatches, matches, and dispatches. Who's being born, who's getting married, who's leaving, who's dying. The need to reach out to the have-nots in the community, not just the haves, because helping people become full-fledged members of a community builds support for the community newspaper into the long haul. Of course, the need for those in the news organization, especially the journalists, to get involved in the community, doing things such as service journalism, solutions journalism, holding events that bring people together, like the forums idea, which I ran public issues forum in the 90s. It was a ton of work, and it often was very divisive, but very create, not just by providing content, but by being a community connector through events, forums, moderated feedback channels, et cetera. So as Teri noted in the previous session, the Academy has not been a friend to the cause overall, but there have been a few of us over the years who have been, carrying that water as best we can. We've been working from within for decades to bring more attention to the importance of successful community news in a democracy. But I am going to disagree a little that the Academy is largely responsible for the current problem, because I think the local news crisis is very much an own goal of the local news industry. I think that industry leaders have ignored the research of the past. They've ignored the research of the present. They've ignored the good advice offered with goodwill from academics who had legitimate concerns about the erosion of quality and the erosion of community cohesions. And a lot of these industry leaders have ignored the warnings that they have been given. So I guess my takeaway is, as Clay said, we in the Academy can do a better job of making our research more digestible and more accessible to practitioners who, don't really want to figure out what a chi-square is or what the p-value means. So we can figure that out. But having the profession a little bit more open to working with us and listening to what we have to say. I've experienced a lot of pushback over the years when people ask me a question and I give them an answer, an informed answer that's based on research that I've read or research that I've done, and they don't like the answer, and then they're like, "Oh, you're just an academic. What do you know?" You know what? I worked 7 days a week as a newspaper reporter. I worked nights and mornings and weekends and holidays. I've covered floods by being in the flood zone. I've covered blizzards by being out in the blizzards. I've ran to shootings and to get art and get comments and figure out what's going on, make sure the police are doing their jobs. So, I've done it. I've been a community journalist, and most of us who do this research have been community journalists. And so our research is built upon observations of professional experience. Just because we switched to the academy doesn't mean that we aren't still journalists at heart, and that we don't understand the realities of the industry. So I'll stop there, and hopefully my connection didn't cut out.
Well, thank you, Bill. Okay, so I'm going to just start with one question. We'll open it up. I know we're a little over time, but so this, I'm asking for a friend. What could academic administrators, say deans, do to help with this conundrum that you guys have talked about? Clay, do you want to start?
Yes. The academy tends to value certain types of research in certain types of places. And often those places are inaccessible to people who aren't in the academy. So I would say to deans and provosts and presidents, look at your tenure and promotion guidelines and ask yourself, are we really only going to count scholarly work that's going to cost the layman $100 a pop to read?
Bill, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I agree with Clay. I think the work that faculty do to support community journalism should be recognized and not segmented into, oh, that's just service, or that's not really good research. And also, I think the academic department should be a little less starstruck by, it's like, oh my gosh, this person's from the New York Times. They must, well, yeah, they're from the New York Times, but they probably don't know shit about Sheboygan, and including how to spell it. And so, it's like, why not think about hiring people and giving credit to people who had careers at smaller media and in community media, who can bring that perspective, that diverse perspective, to the faculty, rather than just having, one line after another of people who have prestige titles in their resumes.
And I would add, Jennifer, that administrators could say, okay, you may not have a master's degree, but you got plenty of skills here. Put you on as a lecturer, non-tenure track. There are plenty of proven practitioners who can do that.
Yeah, that's true, Al. The arrogance, and even a master's degree, is often looked down upon. I mean, we have some people who think if you don't have a PhD, you're dirt. You don't deserve to be on the tenure track. You can't possibly know how to do research. I've always been of the opinion that, show me what you can do. If you can do the work, good. If you're a good teacher, good. If you can do good research, good. And I don't care about your pedigree. I don't care about your credentials.
We can ask how many people in our medical school actually have PhDs. Very few of the faculty in med schools would have a PhD, so they've got the professional experience. So let's open it up for questions. Do we have a couple of questions for our group? Yeah.
This is kind of off base maybe a little bit, but just something came into my head when Clay was talking. First, I want to thank Al and the Institute in UK for not only this, but because of the Institute for Rural Journalism, I am more informed than I have been since it started. And if we didn't have this, we wouldn't be having these kind of conversations, and we would have more questions than we would have answers at this point. So thank you all for what you do. And I appreciate people like Al who can take research and put it into layman's terms for me. But Clay, when you were talking about the research you did in the Appalachian area, Have you seen any correlation in communities with any type of leadership programs or anything like that?
That's a really good question that I don't know if I'm equipped to answer. I do a lot of case study work, so and much of the work that I have done has focused on communities that are really kind of resource poor in terms of social capital and that sort of things. Even in those places, community leaders do emerge out of their experiences, but I hate to do this on YouTube, but the answer to your question is I don't know.
Well, thank you for your honesty.
I'm concerned as much as referring to the programs that often chambers of commerce or other groups have to develop leadership, usually among mid-career people and younger people in communities.
And some of the travels I've done, and then one experience I had personally was an event that I was pulling together for my county and another county adjacent to us. And I made one phone call to that other county, and 4 hours later, they had it coordinated. And it took, I did most of the work on mine because no one stepped up to do it. But I started looking at these counties where I see these activities, whether it's economic development, whether it's community development, whether it's just a cohesiveness, because that's what's missing in so many of our communities is we're not cohesive and we're not cooperative. And I kept seeing these formal groups that help make that happen. And that group exists no matter who's judge or who's mayor or who's in elected position. They all go on, but this group stays in somebody's hands. And I'm just wondering how much of an impact that has on a community.
There are organizations in the region that do a lot of that kind of work. The Mountain Association came up earlier, and as you were talking, it brought to mind the work that the Mountain Association does, which is a lot of economic development work, but also a lot of community development work. And I think they do excellent work. So there are organizations like that that are working in some of these communities that don't have the same levels of research of resource.
And one of what you're developing is to create a community foundation. Community foundations are a wonderful device to get money to people who would like to leave a legacy to their communities, but they don't have a trusted place to leave it. I found that communities that have community foundations usually have pretty good continuing leadership and a good civic infrastructure.
When I get finished helping save my courthouse, that's my next project.
Have any more questions for Bill or Clay? Okay, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you guys so much for sharing your work with us. And while I still have the microphone, I am going to give a shout out to Chris and Kenny in the back for the tech support that they did connect this, 1820 meeting house to a log cabin in Ohio, and pretty well went off without a glitch, so thank you guys. Thanks to Heather, who's been live blogging, if not following on Twitter, Heather Chapman has lots of good coverage, and a special shout out to Tracy Hutchinson, who has kept us all fed and taken care of. And last but not least, let's please give it up one more time for us.
Thank you. I am sure. So if somebody will get Matt a microphone, we'll hear what he has to say.
Well, I wanted to get my money's worth, so. I have a request, and you may have already sent this out, and I didn't see it, but I would love to have a contact list for everyone that attended.
We will send out an attendees list with emails, and the PowerPoint will also be distributed.
Thank you.
Am I on? Okay. Before I leave, I want to remind everyone that some of the things I said yesterday about what I thought newspapers should do and the kind of advertising I thought they should sell has come from research I've done over the last couple of years, working with the National Newspaper Association and talking to community newspapers all over the country in virtually every state, different times, different sizes, so on. And one of the things that I do is I write a column twice a month for NNA members about advertising, great, innovative and creative advertising ideas. I know all of you here, if you're not in the business yourself, you might know someone in the business who is known for being creative and innovative. And that's what I'm looking for. And if you know someone who is creative and innovative and has a great advertising idea in the business, or knows somebody who knows somebody, reference, I'll follow up on them. And I share those with newspapers all over the country. And we've had, I think this nice lady behind me gave me a nice shout out yesterday. I appreciate that. She reads my column, and it's a good thing because we're all in this together, and it's up to us to all help each other. And that's one way we can do it. Thank you.
Why I invited him to be here, because he really is a broker of great ideas. Tom Sylvester.
Yeah, one observation. Usually when you go to a conference, the ideas are 3 years old. It took the person 3 years ago to think of the idea, 1 year to get it approved, and 1 year to get invited to a conference. But what struck me was how dynamic the presentations were. It was almost, to a person, they were in the middle of it. And that kind of told me where we are right now, that there are many people figuring it out. It could go this way, it could go that way, it could go this way. But they're going to try to find it out. But how dynamic and how in the middle things were, which tells me we've left the past, but we're in a transition state, and we know what the desired state is, but stay tuned on when we get there.
We're in a fast-moving stream, and around the bend, there's a rapids of some kind. It may be a class. Be that way. Going, because I think the question that we're asking has to keep on being asked. So look for an invitation in a few months. We'll put something else together. And what examples can we find of reason for encouragement and things to model? And hopefully Teri will come up with something with these folks in Kansas. Be very interested to see and how that turns out. That is applied research in the highest sense.
Just a few things I would like some of the academics to keep in mind as they're doing their research, things that would be beneficial to me and things that they should. One of the things I've noticed a lot here is a big push and emphasis on the internet as opposed to print publication. And you know, we have a website. We push stuff out to our website. We have a really nice website, actually. But one of the things that Clay touched on this briefly is the lack of broadband out in rural communities, and especially in Appalachia. You know, if we get in Carter County, where I'm at, Grayson is crowing about their broadband that they're bringing into the community, but Windstream refuses to go outside of the city because the ROI is not high enough if they get out into the county. Even though they're using Kentucky Wired funds to fund what they're Grayson, they've also asked the city to put up bond money, which the city has done, but the county can't afford to do that. So there are huge, huge groups of people that are being left out of this process, and their voices aren't being heard. And that isn't just with the internet, though. You know, I think you talked a little earlier, too, about you gave all kinds of things to think about. The disenfranchisement of our voters, and it's not just gerrymandering. In Carter County this year, the Board of Elections, because of a lack of money and a lack of polling places, decided to just do 4 polling places for, I think we have 12 voting districts. Now, people could vote wherever they wanted to, but what they chose to do with these 4 polling places was to cluster them in the 2 cities. So you had 2 polling places at schools that are literally across the street from each other, in Grayson and in Olive Hill. And Carter County is a huge county. People from Carter City could not get out to vote. People from Hitchens could not get out to vote. I know these places don't mean anything to you, but these are our rural communities that are out in the far corners of this county. You know, this is a county that takes me 4 hours to go across back and forth to deliver my newspapers on a Wednesday. This is a big area, and these are elderly people that still have concerns about COVID, that can't afford the gas to get into town and vote, and are just confused by the whole process because they've always gone to their local school to vote. And these are things that I would just like for the academics here that are studying this to keep in mind. You know, you talk about addressing the poverty, and the poverty is the issue. The counties don't have the money to fund what they need to give the people the access to the internet or even to voting. And it's not just the gerrymandering, like I said, it's the polling places themselves that they can't even get to anymore.
Jeremy, to your broadband point, and Clay, I think what you were getting at is the fact that these broadband data that we find on the FCC website or whatever, basically garbage data from telecommunications companies. You know, if you don't get granular, I think they may have it by zip code in some cases, but zip code territories are really crazy, as people in this room know. So I think your idea for more granular research, community by community, you know, go out and ask people in Carter City. You know, there's a little test you can do with any smartphone to see what kind of download and upload speed you had. You could go out and interview 25 people there. And
smartphones are the other thing. That's something that I hear all the time whenever I say, we don't have the broadband. Is that, well, everybody has a smartphone. But there's a reason that I listen to podcasts when I'm driving, delivering my newspapers. It's because you lose access every other hill. You might come into a holler, you know, or get up on a ridge top and you'll get access for like 3 minutes, but then you're back down in the holler and you don't have any access. Even if there's, you know, even if you have decent self-service in the county in theory, it's spotty all over. So that's something else that I think people need to keep in mind as they're talking about just use your smartphone. You can't always. It's not always an option for everyone.
Clay?
For 5 minutes, and then you won't have service for 5 minutes, then it'll be back to 5 minutes. You know, one of the other components of this is, I don't want to get super political, but a lot of this information exists but is not widely circulated. I think there is a discussion about lobbying the government to hold telecommunications to the fire about at least being transparent about some of this as well. I think that needs to be part of this part of the broadband discussion has to be continuing to hold government accountable for holding these companies accountable.
And the person in this room who I think has done the most broadband reporting is Ryan Craig. You started jumping on the telephone companies a decade ago.
Yes, I've been up their ass for quite a while. What I will say though, Al, is the one thing we had to do. AT&T will come to town, and AT&T will say, "Well, it's not in our business model," but yet they'll tell you why they're not going to do what they're going to do. What we did was we asked all of our readers. We went online, we went on Facebook. We asked all of our readers, "Where does your phone work? Where doesn't it work?" We made a map. And when we made that map, we brought it to the next meeting AT&T showed up for in town, and they took a beating because, you know, we basically, the paper they showed up, we put the map in the paper, 4 by 10 or 12 on the front page and said, here's where the cell phones work, here where they don't. there's going to be a meeting with AT&T, and they're going to tell you that they can't come to these areas. Please ask them why, because I mean, it was the point is that it was getting ridiculous. One famous thing, we had a state representative who had AT&T, the Kentucky Wired people at the time. The governor, I don't even remember. It was like 10, 12 years ago. Martha Jane King, some may know her name. She put $100 down on a table and said, if any of you can make a phone call out of this room, I'll give you this $100. And of course, none of them could. And so the point is that it is a thing where if you get more aggressive. Now, I will say this, is they've put some towers up, it is better, but during the pandemic, the school system, Verizon was the only one that had good enough network. They had to buy those little Verizon, or rent them, I don't know, those little Verizon towers so kids could take them home to do their homework while they were doing, and this happened all over Kentucky. And in some counties, they couldn't even do that because they didn't have enough service to even send them home. So they wanted them to go home and do these packages during the pandemic, and they couldn't. So, and it's Gilda Legg, who spoke, I think, at the very first one you did of these back in '07. We interviewed her, and she actually said, right after this thing in 2007, I interviewed her, and she said, in her opinion, farm to market roads and electricity were the most important things for rural areas in the last century. Without a doubt, this century, it would be wireless internet or broadband speed internet. And it hasn't happened.
And she was administrator of the Rural Utilities Service
Yes.
of the USDA.
Hilda, there you go. Hilda Gay Legg, there you go. And she just basically, that was in 2007 that she said that. And we're sitting here having the same, it is one of the most frustrating things in my life. My blood pressure's up just hearing it. But I have one other comment about the things going on today. One thing that you talked about the different reasons why people don't do things or believe in the media. In the city of Trenton, Kentucky, they had a liquor vote. The liquor vote had to be done in the town. It's kind of the rule when they do that with the new rules the state General Assembly put out. So they had to get a voting poll in the town instead of at the local elementary school, which is out of the town. The only place to do the vote was in the local church because it's the only place that had ADA compliant bathrooms. Well, I knew a guy that actually held a meeting and got the signatures to put it on the ballot. And I said to him, I said, did you go in and cast your vote? It failed, obviously. But I said, did you go and vote? He said, hell no, I went to Sunday school there. So I do think we need to take a long look at what religion has to do with some of this. I know people that will vote every single election against their own self-interest because the candidate they have is for abortions. And if you don't think that's part of what we need to deal with in rural America, is that a lot of things that don't get done are that. And if you look somebody in the eye and they will tell you, I don't care if my children basically suffer at school, or I send someone to Frankfurt that I know is going to vote against basically everything my county stands for, except that they'll still vote for them. And that is where we need to come to that realization about what happens in a small rural place. And but yes, long story short, those two things, if I could say that I've come from the rural area that I've seen, is that you have got a lot of things that don't happen literally because you have preachers get up pulpits and tell them not to trust the local media, which my uncle and my grandfather are actually fairly famous preachers in Kentucky, and neither one of them, they were dead set against politics in the pulpit, but that has gone by the wayside.
And you had an uncle, who I must say, Ryan, Larry Craig, who was both a preacher and a publisher, and he packed a pistol.
Yes, he did, yes. I do not have my pistol on me, I promise.
And I should add that Ryan is not only the director of student media for the college, but he remains the owner and publisher of the Todd County Standard in Elkton, Kentucky. Robert?
I'll have to say, when you mentioned about broadband, of course, that's a topic in every state, and everybody suffers to varying degrees. I'll have to tell you that Georgia has come a long way in just the last few years because the state of Georgia is partnering with each rural electric cooperative, and they are providing broadband service through all the rural electric cooperative areas all over the state.
Yeah, we had an item on the rural blog just this week about how a number of states, even though they may prevent municipal electrics from offering internet, they're letting the rural electric co-ops do it, and it is really a boon.
It really is. And one quick story, you're talking about AT&T, to tell you how things get manipulated. AT&T, this is a number of years ago, but AT&T had most of the service in our area, and I could make a cell phone call anywhere in town unless I was down at my office. And then I couldn't make any calls, and I couldn't receive any calls from my office. And because I was on AT&T. And then AT&T announced they were going to put up a new cell tower in our community. And then I found out that the AT&T press representative, who I happen to know, let me know that they're not going to build a new cell tower in your county because they redirected that to go somewhere else in North Georgia. Well, I live 240 miles south of Atlanta, which is nowhere land in Georgia, I can tell you. And when I found out about that, I wrote an editorial about all our AT&T subscribers. Here's what AT&T is doing with the money to build our tower. It's going to somewhere outside of Atlanta. And well, immediately after that editorial came out, I got a telephone call, and a guy showed up at my office, and he came in and he had a briefcase. And he said, "Mr. Williams," he said, "I want to see if I can do something to help your service." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "What's the address here?" And I gave him the address, and he opened up his briefcase and had a laptop in it. Opened up the laptop, this program came up, and this map came up. And he asked what was our address, and he put in our address. The graph showed this coverage area where the area the cell tower covered, and showed where our office was, and our office was just off where this coverage area didn't reach. He started tweaking on the keyboard, and I watched the graphic as the coverage area moved, shifted over to cover our office. He said, check you see what kind of signal you got now. And I had a great signal in. And I said, well, I got two questions. One, what happens to people who are on this other side of the coverage area? He said, they don't own a newspaper. That's the God's truth. And then I said, well, listen, I have a condo over on St. Simon's Island, an hour from here, and I have the same trouble there. He said, what's the address? He called up and did the same thing there. And I thought to myself, well, I've seen it all now. I couldn't believe it.
I think somebody could do a pretty good article about rural broadband and newspapers that try to address the problem. It really is an overarching problem in rural America. It is getting better in lots of places, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Jay Nolan.
I'll echo the sentiments of a lot of publishers. We really appreciate you guys doing this, the University of Kentucky and the Institute. Having this forum, I think it's been very helpful. Also echo the thoughts that this was a great thing, and Tom mentioned earlier that it's exactly what is going on right now, and that's fantastic. My big concerns are twofold. One, you've got a plan to address, and that's the economic or ethnic diversity or lack thereof we have in the journalism field, particularly in a lot of the rural areas. And I think that's something we need to work hard to overcome. The second question for the academics and the people that are in the business now, there's a lot of older, whiter guys that are running businesses that are just getting older and whiter. They're not getting wiser and brighter. They're getting older and whiter. We need to fire a bunch of them and bring in some newer, younger, diverse ideas. And I think that's great. But it's hard for us to do that when students don't grasp what Charlie was talking about, the impact they can have on a person's life, and how that person's life can have such an impact on the community with the stories they write and the things they do. And then during the pandemic, KPA, Kentucky Press Association, had to, because of this pandemic, cancel internships for the year. And so my group stood up and said, we're going to fund an internship anyway. And Al worked with us really hard, and Buck Ryan worked with us really hard, and we couldn't get a journalism intern from UK. So if the academics can help encourage students with the message that you were giving, hey, this is a field where you can change lives, and you can work in a business, you can manage the business, and maybe even own the business. Maybe we can turn that around for the people that are in this room and in the future generations. So I think that's a way that the academic community could really help us in the business side too. So thank you for the great presentations.
You're welcome, Jay. And I think every community journalism course ought to have a syllabus or a bulletin entry that says something about path to management and ownership. Because there really are lots of papers out there that need buyers. That's why Jim Iovino's program got started at West Virginia, because a bunch of West Virginia publishers could not find buyers for their newspapers. They had the same problem in Texas. I worked with them to get something started on it. It's a national problem. You know, Marshall Helmberger doesn't want to sell his paper to a chain, and I don't want him to sell it to a chain. I would rather it be locally owned. I subscribe to what the National Trust for Local News says. Let's have local newspapers locally owned. I think in general, local ownership is the best. I know there's a lot of advantages to chains too. You have more resources that you can draw on. But if you're looking for buyers, there's just not enough independent buyers and capital available to people who want to do that. And we need to work on that too. And maybe that's a place that foundations can work on. That's one thing Marshall and I discussed earlier, is that maybe foundations need to find a way to connect and vet buyers and sellers and papers, because there is a civic interest, I think, in having the best possible newspaper owners, and foundations ought to be able to play a role in that. Jim has a point.
Yeah, so like in our program, it started with the West Virginia Press Association and our the dean of our college, who's now the provost at the university. But now we've expanded out. University of Texas is now sending a person who is an interest in purchasing several papers in that state to our program to like learn how to do it and then take it back and take over these newsrooms. Several other press associations across the country are interested in sending folks our way as well. And you know, now we've added a certificate program. This is all remote. So if there's anyone in your own organizations who you feel might be like the next in line or has that interest in eventually taking over what you do, it may be a wise move to have them come into our program so that they can learn everything, learn how to be sustainable for the long term in this business going forward, bring that back to implement those ideas, and then you can work out a plan to have them eventually be the successor there. We also have just a number of people in our program who come in, they know they want to do this, they want to be entrepreneurs somewhere in the country, they don't have an exact idea where. So if you have a paper that you don't want to sell to a corporate chain and you want to have an individual owner take it over and run it as properly as a community newspaper should be, we have people who are coming to our program who are willing to move to different parts of the country to do this sort of thing. So I have a database of papers who are looking for owners. I've got a database of people who are looking to purchase in some part of the country. So I'm happy to talk to anybody at any point in time about this kind of stuff and how I can help you out in any way I can. So that's why I'm there. So, good.
Any further questions, comments, observations, suggestions, disputations, challenges? Buck Ryan always has a challenge.
This is a challenge for Al Cross. So my guess, not having been at the original National Summit so many years ago, that there were many, many of the same concerns, problems, and challenges.
Not exactly.
Okay, so
it was more an issue was the future of rural America and how it was dragging the newspapers down. As many of you have said, a newspaper is about as healthy as its community is. And we saw a decline in rural America, which is leading to a decline in newspapers. And believe it or not, the digital challenge was the last minute addition to the. So go ahead.
No, so as someone who I admire as providing, instant commentary and punditry, Al Cross, the legendary Al Cross, what is your kind of state of where we are based on what you've heard over the past couple of days? So how do you assess, maybe from the original summit to where we are now to what the next steps may be?
You sound like the rewrite man talking to a reporter at a disaster scene saying, give me 200 words. Well, number one, I think there's reason for encouragement because we have people like the National Trust for Local News, the American Journalism Project, the Institute for Nonprofit News, and Report for America, which very much wanted to be here. We have great examples to look at. You've heard great examples here today. I think you're increasingly going to find nonprofit as being a viable alternative. And, I've had one publisher say, well, I might as well go nonprofit. I'm not making any money. You don't have to pay taxes. You can take grants, tax-deductible donations. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that an umbrella nonprofit that might own several papers in an area is a real interesting prospect. We have the folks in New Jersey looking at another acquisition. We have the possibility of at least one publisher in this region going nonprofit and perhaps reaching out to a couple of others later on to have an umbrella organization. I have volunteered to be part of that because I think going nonprofit, there's a really good point made today, and I forget who made it. It doesn't mean you're non-commercial. It just means that you're putting the priority on civic service, not on making money for a business. And for a lot of newspapers, they're making enough money, really small papers, they make enough money to support a household or two. And you might as well go nonprofit. They're probably not taking many distributions. They're probably getting most of their benefits and salary. So to me, that's an encouraging development too. And that's one reason I really wanted to have Liz Parker here, and I was glad she was still able to participate by Zoom. But thank you for the question, Buck. Probably a good one to end on unless we have another. All right, I want to thank everyone for their participation and support. The Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues exists to help rural journalists define the public agenda in their communities through strong reporting and commentary, especially on issues that affect communities but don't have good local sources. We've been editorially focused for most of our history, the 18 years I've been at the University of Kentucky. But in the last 8 years or so, we have been increasingly focused on sustainability, on the business side, on helping publishers and editors adapt to the digital challenge. Now, we're no experts, but we try to engage them with experts, and that's essentially what this meeting is about. We also know that newspapers are not going to be successful without community support, and that's why we phrased the research question of this meeting the way we did. How do rural communities sustain local journalism that serves local democracy? And I would ask our online audience and all those in the room to keep thinking about that question. We bid you a good day.